Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I'd like to welcome you to this second edition of Sustainable Finance, Preserving Ecosystems for Future Generations. We've got a very interesting and exciting lineup for you today, which is very, very thorough, I have to say. Our first workshop is Banking Under the New EU Regulations, and I would like to welcome Luís Legina, who's board member from the Bank of Portugal. Now, banks have been facing a substantial amount of regulatory challenges, including the convergence of regulations, data protection, operational resilience, credit quality, capital and liquidity, and financial crime, obviously. But climate change regulations, instigated from the EU, from a financial stability perspective, will have a substantial impact on the balance sheet of companies and also on the bank's exposure to physical risk. And financing this path to transition, to this green transition, is not just a question of stock, but also a question of flow. It will grow, but at the moment it is in a very embryonic form, and there are lots of incognitos. So I would like to call to the stand Luís Legina de Sousa, board member of the Bank of Portugal.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Paulo Soares de Oliveira for the invitation to be here. I would also like to salute the speakers and all those that will be attending, either physically or remotely through streaming. It is a great pleasure for me to join for the second time an event organized by PSO and dedicated to sustainability. This year, I think the stakes are even higher, given the reference to preserving ecosystems for future generations, which is included in the event title. And it's not easy to bring into central banks' thinking and functioning themes that are not immediately identifiable with their mandates. It was not easy, and it is still very challenging to incorporate topics such as sustainability, climate change, and energy transition into the strategies, into the structure of central banks. So I think you all can imagine the challenge of embedding into our way of thinking topics such as biodiversity and ecosystems preservation, which appear very far away from a central bank main concern. Having this in mind, I will try to organize the messages I would like to convey to you around three main topics. The first topic focus on sustainability and especially on the energy transition. And here I will mention the path that has been taken and the main risks and opportunities for the financial sector. And a lot of things that are being done in this respect, they can also be taken as a good proxy for my second topic. And my second topic is related to biodiversity loss. This topic, I would say, runs the risk of becoming the next big ticket item in financial stability concerns. And if it reaches that level, it will become an extremely relevant topic for all entities which have financial stability preservation in their mandates, and of course central banks are one of such entities. I would say that it's clear that the level of awareness in central banks regarding biodiversity is still far from the awareness that already has been attained in terms of energy transition. But we are getting there rather fast, and probably that will happen in a non-linear way. The third topic I intend to address relates to a gigantic challenge that we need to face in order to take sound sustainability-related decisions. And I'm talking about the data challenge, making sure that we have comprehensive, reliable, timely and cost-effective data is still, and it will continue to be, a very key concern to deal with sustainability. And it was interesting to see that it is the subject of one of today's panels. I'm also aware that a lot of what I will be saying here, it won't be a novelty for many of you here and on streaming, but that is, I must say, my intention, because dealing with matters where the main concern, the matters that we are addressing, the main concern here is not to bring novelty each time we talk about them. The main concern is to make sure that they become absorbed in an adequate way by the economic agents that are impacted by them, and being absorbed means also that they incorporate these topics into their actions. Like it happened last year, and I think that's also the purpose of this preliminary remarks, is to open up a little bit so it's more breadth rather than depth, because that will be up to the following sessions to address. If I have time, I hope so, I will then at the end try to summarize, just in case I get too broad. I will try to summarize in 3 or 4 messages what I would like to be retained from my messages. So before moving into the 3 main messages I've just mentioned, just a quick remark to say that about a year ago in the first PSO conference, I had the opportunity to provide an overview of the central bank approach to the climate change. And since then, this, we can call it fight against climate change, has seen its position strengthened at the top of what we can say is the global concerns agenda. And this has occurred in spite of what is probably the fierce competition in terms of attention we could imagine, which is the pandemic we've been going and we're still dealing with. And you know, warning signals about this problem, they have been intensifying in this climate change front. We all see it very clearly in the news. But we also have witnessed an incredible increase of initiatives that try to address this same problem. And we're talking about initiatives covering areas such as political, legislative, regulatory, scientific, technical, or even in the media, in the media area. But despite this road that has been taken, we have in front of us what could be described as a marathon to take us from the Paris commitment to the carbon neutrality, and we are still very far from the finish line. That means that we need to keep up and increase the pace of our progress. And events like this, I think they can be good opportunities to help us, guiding us through this, I would say, uncharted road. So the timing of this event is also very fortunate, because we are just a few weeks away from COP26, and this year's edition has set a very ambitious goal for the financial sector, which is to ensure that every financial decision takes climate change into account. So coming to the first topic I want to deal with, it is about, as I mentioned, sustainability, and primarily about the energy transition and the risks and opportunities to the financial sector. What I would like to start by saying is that I think that's known by everyone, that the financial sector plays what is an absolutely critical role in this process of transition to a sustainable economy. On one hand, I think that's beyond dispute that the balance sheets of the financial institutions, they are affected by environmental risks. And these risks, they need to be adequately managed to safeguard financial stability. On the other hand, the energy transition, it will only be possible if the financial system is able to finance a very significant amount of essential investments which will have to occur over the coming decades. And if financial stability is at stake, so this ability by the financial sector to provide these amounts that are required will also be at stake. So we are faced here with a duality situation, and this duality is a kind of a particular case for the financial system of the concept of double materiality that applies to the corporate world in more general terms. And to the corporate world, we'll say that on one side, the firm's assets and their balance sheets, they are affected by the impact of climate change. But on the other hand, the corporate, the firm's decisions or the activities they perform, they can contribute either to aggravate or to mitigate the climate change. So if we take that to the financial system, given the centrality of the financial system, whether in relation to the stock of assets or in relation to the flow of resources that are directly and indirectly impacted by sustainability, it is crucial that on a permanent basis we are capable of ensuring the resilience of the financial sector throughout this entire transition process, which is triggered by climate policies. And here the Portuguese Central Bank, Banco de Portugal, has a vast field of action, both as an entity which is responsible for safeguarding financial stability, and also as a banking supervisor. And this action, of course, it's framed within the single supervisory mechanism, which is common to the euro area countries and also to other EU member states. And I would like to take this opportunity to give a little bit more detail about what the bank has been doing, especially in two areas. One area has to do with the work that has been carried out in terms of assessing the financial risks that arise from climate change. And another area of action has to do with the involvement in the adaptation of the regulatory and the supervisory framework. And as far as the assessment of financial risks for climate change is concerned, the first step towards understanding the extent to which physical and transition climate risks can pose a threat to financial stability is to quantify the financial institutions' exposure to these risks. And this is very challenging, and the reason why it is, there are many reasons why it is challenging. They come from the uncertainty involved, they come from the long materialization horizons that are also involved, they come from the non-linearity of the processes, and also from the dependence on short-term actions, on the activity involved in the sectors, and also on how these exposures are located. So all of these are just some factors that make it particularly difficult to assess climate and environmental risks. Let me just take some water. And here, even if I ignore, at least for the time being, one major issue, which is data availability, I will talk about it later. The fact is that the traditional risk measurement techniques, they are based on statistical relationships that are extracted from the past information, and therefore they are not the most suitable to assess these climate risks. Because climate risks are largely unpredictable, and also transition risks, they don't have a historical precedent. In spite of these difficulties, we at the Central Bank, we want to contribute to building a path based essentially on technical and scientific knowledge. Instead of guessing, or in Portuguese that we call it achismo. I don't know if this word exists in dictionary, but I'll just use it as if it exists. And when we don't have technical or scientific knowledge, you know, this achismo tends to fill the gaps, and it's a very dangerous thing to happen. And this is why Banco Portugal, as we have recently published a study about Portuguese banking systems' exposure to firms which are most sensitive to transition to a low-carbon economy. And the results of this study suggest that around 60% of the bank's exposure to non-financial corporations are in climate policy-relevant sectors. Especially in construction, real estate sectors, and to a lesser extent in transport and energy-intensive industries. In addition to the evaluation of the risk to financial stability, the Portuguese Central Bank has also been actively involved in this ongoing work at the European level to adapt the regulatory and the supervisory framework. And this work aims to encourage financial institutions to make this progress in identifying, in measuring, and also mitigating the climate and the environmental risks that they are subject to, particularly over the medium to long-term horizon. And it is also important to stress that climate risk has been one of the main risks identified by the SSM since 2019, and it has been gaining importance since then. In line with this priority that is given to this risk, in November last year, the ECB, the European Central Bank, published a very important guide on climate-related and environmental risks. And this guide sets the supervisory expectations for what are known as, or are described as, significant institutions, which are the financial institutions that fall under the direct supervision of the ECB. A gap analysis has been done, and it revealed that the vast majority of European banks are still very far from ensuring that their practices are aligned with these supervisory expectations that were included in the guide. So this means that they will need to increase the effort to adapt their risk management tools. I would also like to stress that Banco Portugal has extended these supervisory expectations also to the institutions that fall under its direct supervision. So this will come into force, this extension, in the second quarter of 2022. And the purpose here is to ensure that there is a consistent and balanced treatment between supervised entities, but of course taking into account proportionality criteria that needs to be in place. In addition to the publication of this guide, the ECB has also decided that the next stress test for the banking system, which will be carried out by the SSM in 2022, it will focus on climate-related risks, both physical and transition risks. And I would like to change gears, to switch gears a little bit here, just to say that even if the notion of risk, when we use this word, it comes typically associated with a negative perception, but in reality, risk, if properly managed, can also be associated to very significant opportunities. And we should recall, based on what I just said, the words of Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and also advisor to the British Prime Minister for the COP26. He said that the transition to a more sustainable economy could turn an existential risk into the greatest commercial opportunity of our life, or of our time, better said. So achieving this carbon neutrality, if it is taken seriously, it will imply a very profound and radical economic transformation, which will reach all sectors of activity. And of course, this will force non-financial corporations, insurers, banks, asset managers to adjust their business models, and doing so in a very profound way. And the transition towards a greener economy also implies, this is related to the opportunity part, a substantial volume of investment over several decades. And this will only be achieved through a combination of public and probably to a much larger extent private investment. It's not just a question of volume, which by itself is already extremely relevant, but it's also the financing instruments that need to be used. They will also have to be adjusted. When we talk about sustainable investments, projects, they usually involve very innovative technologies, significant costs in R&D. They have a strong capital intensity. They also have very long implementation horizons. It can be 10, 20, 30 years. So this requires the availability of instruments such as equity, quasi-equity, venture capital, which have to come in parallel or combined with the more traditional instruments of bank credit and bonds. So, and this goes without saying, that in order to support all these financing decisions, including their adequate pricing, there is one crucial element that needs to be present, and that element is reliable and comparable data. I will talk about that later, but let me just briefly touch upon another topic that has been gaining relevance and in the context of environmental sustainability concerns. And as I mentioned earlier, maybe the next big ticket item of financial stability, and I'm referring to the preservation of biodiversity. This debate of environmental sustainability, especially over the last decade, it has been largely dominated by the phenomenon of climate change. But there are other things happening as we talk, which are also relevant. And among these, the biodiversity loss is the one I would like to bring here today. It was considered the fourth biggest global risk in 2020 in the survey of the World Economic Forum. And it came immediately after infectious diseases, climate action, more exactly the failure of climate action, or weapons of mass destruction. This rise of the biodiversity loss in the ranking of the global concerns has to do with several factors, such as changes in the land or in the water that it is used globally, the depletion of natural resources, the proliferation of invasive species, pollution, and of course, climate change itself. It's a cause of biodiversity loss. And this not just contributes to increase the global warming, this biodiversity loss, but it also affects the ecosystems and their ability to provide a number of services that are very important for the economies to work properly. And among these services, just in very brief words, the supply of food and commodities, regulation services, and here regulation, I'm not talking about the central bank regulation, but I'm talking about regulations, natural regulations such as pollination, for instance, or even cultural services, because there are a number of industries such as tourism that are depending on properly functioning ecosystems. And I will just pick the example of pollination. I don't know if ever someone from a central bank has talked about pollination, but I hope that won't become a problem. But I want to use this example to illustrate what is the economic relevance of ecosystem services. And pollination is becoming increasingly threatened, and the problem is, at least for the time being, it doesn't have an appropriate artificial replacement. And there is an economic value that is calculated associated to pollination, which is somewhere between 5 and 8% of the market value of global agricultural crops. So it is not difficult to manage the damage that can be caused if this service were to be discontinued. If we multiply this example by many others, I think we can very easily conclude about the economic and financial relevance of biodiversity, and particularly if it is degraded. And we can also assume that if economic theory is capable of explaining why climate change is happening, and as a result of the economic agents' action, be it corporations, be it individuals, be it institutions, it can also be very useful to explain, adapt, to use the economic theory to try to understand what is the cause of biodiversity loss. And as the origin of this phenomenon, it's what economists say an externality that translates into misalignment between the private and the social valuation of biodiversity services. And as it was the case with climate change, mostly physical and transition risks, that ultimately they translate into stability risks. Here too, when we talk about biodiversity loss, it can become a source of a very relevant financial stability risk. But as I said, also in the other case, here too, in the risks and in the how to mitigate them, there are opportunities. And I just hope that I won't be misunderstood and I won't be taken out of context from what I'm going to say next, because it will take some time, and I can't stop stressing this, before central banks can speak about matters such as economic and financial implications of biodiversity loss with the level of confidence that it is recognized for them in other issues. But even without mastering this subject, I think we can and we should contribute to stimulate the discussion. And it is in this sense that I would like my words to be interpreted. And with this cautionary note, there are many elements in this discussion that suggest that a country like Portugal can reap important benefits from biodiversity concerns. Let us think, for example, of the biodiversity services that our vast exclusive economic zone, EEZ as it is known, this zone provides, not just for Portugal, but we can say for the humanity. It is not hard to imagine that if such services, they were to be compensated in financial and economic terms, the amount could be substantial. Or also, if we go briefly to climate change, just consider, again, the exclusive economic zone potential for carbon capture, particularly if we put that in the context of a more efficient and a more effective global carbon emissions market. So in view of this underlying potential that exists, these two subjects, they clearly require our attention for the both at the present and I think at the future. But irrespective of where the ecosystems are located, the economy, the economic theory, it also provides a guide on how to preserve them. And to fight biodiversity loss, it is important that ecosystems are a source of income, and that the healthier the ecosystems, the higher the income they generate. And finding ways to generate income to those who preserve the natural capital, and ways to charge for those who use the natural capital that is represented by ecosystem, it is exactly what economic theory recommends. But, you know, sometimes, and I would say most of the times, what is conceptually very easy to understand, then it is very far from being easily implemented. And to implement a practical solution aligned with economic theory, there is a fundamental starting point. And that fundamental starting point is the ability to measure what natural capital we have, where it is, and to identify also the activities that consume and preserve this natural capital. And this takes me to my third and final message, which is precisely about the importance and challenges of sustainability-related data that I would like to share here today. The availability, the quality, and the comparability of data related to climate change and to biodiversity loss is absolutely critical to perform a good assessment of risks, but also of opportunities related to this phenomena. And this, of course, without forgetting also a very important point, which is the cost component associated to obtaining and using this data. We need data that can respond to many different requirements. Data that enable supervisors to monitor financial stability, the risks, the financial stability risks that are related to climate change and to biodiversity loss. Data that provides investors with the necessary information that they have to use to assess whether investments are sustainable or not, firms are sustainable or not, projects are sustainable or not, and to ensure that what they think is green is effectively green and not just greenwashed. Also, data that informs different stakeholders about what is the firm's transition plans to a more sustainable business models. Over the past few years, there have been a number of institutions such as the IMF, the Financial Stability Board, NGFS, a group of mostly central banks, but other financial institutions, the IFRS Foundation. They have been working hard to develop worldwide initiatives in this area. The European Union, for instance, has been quite active in this process, not to say at the forefront. The taxonomy regulation, the proposals for a corporate sustainability reporting directive in this case, and a green bond standard regulation. These are just two examples of what the EU has been doing in this area. And in what concerns the Portuguese Central Bank, even if I would say a large part of what we do is not visible to the outside world, this does not mean that it is less relevant for our financial system and for the economy. And in this context, we've been very active and we've been involved in a number of initiatives, both in terms of direct involvement in the discussion and trying to shaping this these documents, these processes, but also in our role as advisor to the government on economic and financial matters. And without here trying to be very exhaustive, just to highlight a few things which are very close to our hearts regarding this topic. We have been showing a very particular concern about preventing green regulatory arbitrage and greenwashing, as I just mentioned. We have also very consistently made the point that it is important to concentrate efforts on policies and instruments which, according to a risk and data-based approach, they are more likely to make a difference in contributing to climate objectives. We have also stressed that it could, I would say, not it could, but it is crucial to be transparent about the environmental impact of the current and future activities, investments, and policies. And we've, just to finish this, we have argued that not only we should prevent overlaps and an excessive complexity of the regulatory framework, but the definition of new rules and requirements should also undergo a proportionality test as well. And this is particularly important for not over-penalizing certain countries, firms or entities which are smaller than their peers, depending on their geographic location or even on the complexity of their activities. So I've already spoken maybe too long, and I'm just going to finish in order to take time from the experts on the different panels. They will for sure bring us very interesting perspectives about the many important topics that will be in today's agenda. And as I said at the beginning, I just would like to leave you very short messages as a wrap-up, and also hoping that they will remain alive in the memory of all who are attending this event, either here or in streaming. The first is that we need to continue to focus on properly assessing risk, not only climate risk, but also, it's becoming, as I said, the next ticket item, big ticket item, biodiversity loss, and also on identifying the opportunities that the economic recovery and the energy transition will bring with it. In order to achieve this, filling the data gap and define the right reporting and requirements is absolutely critical. The second is the energy transition is underway and it will speed up. And everything suggests that there will be no postponement of deadlines or easing of new requirements. So this is why financial institutions cannot stay in a position or should not stay in a position of wait and see. The third message is that in order to make the best use of the opportunities of this economic transformation that is lying ahead of us, the institutions, they must integrate into their business strategies, models, their internal governance structures, and also into risk management policies and disclosure. They have to integrate these environmental risks into all that. Fourth and last, just to say that the cost of acting only when all the regulatory and reporting frameworks are complete will probably very likely be much higher than the cost of acting right now, even if with some limitations and some data gaps that we all, I think, recognize. And with this, I come to the end of my messages to share with you today. I wish you all here and participating on streaming an excellent session. And once more to say it was a real pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis, for your very insightful opening remarks, which was very, very thorough. We would like to call to the panel now. Pedro Getz Sanchez, who is the Chair Professor of Finance at IE Business School. Carla Dias, who is the Business Development Director of BBVA. Isabel Laurent of ERBD. And Sofia Santos, who is the Sustainability Consultant for Credito Agricola. The panel will be moderated by André Mestre, who is the Senior Enterprise Accountant Executive for for Microsoft.
I have some slides.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. So to move them, perfect. Should I start? So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I was asked to talk about regulation and climate change, and I titled this way because, especially after this inspiring opening by the board member Luis Laguiña, okay, I'm going to be talking about climate change, banks, and regulators, okay, and I'm going to focus especially on what I see open questions, and I'm coming from academia, okay, I think I'm going to be very complementary to the policy speech we just had, okay, because you're going to see that basically after hearing what we have heard now, it's very clear that there is a broad consensus now among regulators and central bankers that climate change is now a source of risk. It's basically a cause of more frequent and severe natural disasters. And then this implies that there is a need to do something, okay? The first one is we need to measure the risk that corporations and banks are facing. And I think also there is a consensus now among policymakers that there has to be a push, okay, to encourage this transition. And if you see the data, you see that this is a global phenomenon. No matter where you are, this is a map, for example, of the weather hazards that happened this year, 2021, across different places. And I have here kind of the 5 most important ones. One is drought or lack of rain. Then you have heat waves. You have fires. You have storms, especially hurricanes. And then you have flooding. And if you see this map, you are seeing that basically there is no area of the world that didn't have some kind of a natural disaster. The disasters change a bit depending on the areas, but every country is very concerned about this. Europe is taking the lead. If you see the policymakers in Europe, we just have a speech. You don't hear this kind of speeches if you listen, for example, to the Federal Reserve banks, okay? It's like, in terms of climate change, Europe has decided to be the area that is probably taking the more advanced. And I have here Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, that has created a climate change center. Okay, it's the first central bank that has a climate change center. And basically, the idea is we need to push very hard because it's, we believe, a very important issue, okay? And we are happy to be leading the central banks and the regulators on that way. So in this regard, Europe is kind of setting up the agenda, no? And then I was asked to choose regulations, okay? And when you think on regulations, like the previous speaker highlighted, there are still many things open, but I think there are going to be 2 main issues for a regulatory perspective that we are going to have to pay attention to them. The first one is going to be what we call the green asset ratio, okay, GAR. And the second one is climate stress testing. And I want to discuss these two, and I want to focus more especially on climate stress testing, because I think going forward, if you are trying to think on the next maybe 5-10 years, is what's going to play a big role. If you are familiar with stress testing is a very important tool now for regulators. When they do a stress test of a bank and they find that the bank is not satisfying the stress test, first we see market reactions, that this is an important discipline, okay, but the regulators also have the ability to ask to raise capital, to put extra buffers, to prevent payments of dividends. So stress testing is potentially the tool that, if you do this often, is going to create, I think, the largest amount of interactions between regulators and banks on this area. But I want to discuss these two. As you know, in Europe, it's complicated. Sometimes who is in charge? We have somebody today from the Bank of Portugal. We have the European Banking Authority. We have the ECB, right? It's this kind of network. And every player is doing something, and I think they are fairly coordinated. And also the European Commission is playing a role. I tell you, every policymaker in Europe is kind of involved in this one way or the other. So if we go, for example, let's start with the green asset ratio, the European Banking Authority, they issue some kind of guidelines, and the European Commission is basically following these kind of guidelines. What is the idea of this green asset ratio? So the idea is to check in the banks, is to say to the banks, you need to disclose what percentage of your loans and securities they satisfy the European taxonomy on what is green. To discuss the European taxonomy as what is green, it should be another conference, okay? It's a complicated topic, but the idea, and this is very much the European approach, is we are going to have regulators deciding what is kind of a green asset, and I tell you, this is a very hot topic, okay, on what is this, okay? But the idea of this asset ratio is going to be, we define what is a green loan or a green asset. You tell me what percentage of your balance sheet is associated with them, okay? And this is going to impose some kind of discipline, okay, on how green you are, okay? And the idea is try to move capital away from the polluters, right? Because the polluters, your ratios are going to be low, okay? And then the question is how you compute the ratios, okay? That's going to be the big, even lobby process, right? So for example, the European Banking Authority, okay, after consultations with the industry, they proposed to the European Commission, okay, that trading assets should be out of the game. Okay, I tell you, this matters a lot per institutions, because some institutions are very exposed to trading assets, some may be more exposed to sovereign supranational central bank. Think of, for example, government debt, right? It's a big asset for many financial institutions. So then the question is, how do you compute this? The last information we have on this, that is from July, from the European Commission, that was building on this report. If you just go to this webpage, the European Banking Authority here is advising the Commission. So you see here the idea is, basically what we know now, okay, where things are going is, we are going to try to take out the trading assets, the sovereign exposures from the ratio, and then the European Banking Authority did an experiment and say, if we compute now this ratio for European banks, what numbers we get? And they got very low numbers, between 8 and 10%. What's the reason for this? Well, because the taxonomy now, they use, is very strict on what to classify as a green asset. Okay, so I tell you, these things are open, okay, but basically the idea of this tool is let's kind of ask banks or financial institutions to do a full Monty of how green they are with precise numbers, you see, because what's the risk here? The risk is that we can have greenwashing, and every institution says we are very green, but maybe you are more brown, okay? And here the idea of this regulation is kind of doing a photo every year or every few years. This is yet kind of work in progress. The idea is to have this for 2022 first release, then 2024, okay? But I'm thinking long term, this kind of publish us with numbers how green you are is the first kind of regulation that is happening. And the second one is this idea of climate stress testing. Why climate stress testing? Because if you see the last financial crisis, there is one tool after this crisis that every country has applied. It's the idea of a stress test. You see, it's like if you speak with central banks and regulators, the idea of macroprudential policy, you need to check this kind of the macro consequence of banks is applied everywhere. And now the idea is to move this forward. No? If we have traditional stress testing, let's create climate stress testing. This is happening now by steps. Different countries are going in different speeds. Again, you can see that the European area is taking the lead, so just to give you an idea. The first European central bank that started with this, it was Netherlands. It's not here in this picture. I didn't construct this graph, but Fitch, who constructed the graph, they forgot Netherlands. This started Netherlands in 2018. Then, this past year, France, the Central Bank of France has been a big leader on this topic. They conducted the first one, okay, and here the approaches differ. Some are kind of top-down. It means the central bank collects the data and does the analysis. The ECB published one for the white euro area the past week. Others, you get data from financial institutions, what we call bottom to top. Financial institutions disclose the data, and the central bank works with this data. So France was the first country to do a bottom one. Okay, they asked banks in France to send the information, and they computed the climate change exposures, and they released the stress test that they did. I'm going to explain you how the kind of agreement on how to do this, even if it's still a very complex topic. The UK is doing one now, and I think in Europe the big one is going to come next year. The ECB plans to do, together with the European Banking Authority, the first one next year. Okay, they want to start next year for all the kind of systemic European banks that are regulated by these two entities. And then the idea is that the very small banks that are kind of at the national level, so one day you will have the Bank of Portugal taking care of them, okay? But since banking regulation is becoming much more a common issue in Europe, so the ECB European one is going to be the key one. You see that it's going to be in 2022, and that's why the ECB did a kind of a pilot experiment with a top-down approach these past weeks. And this is a global phenomenon. You see here other countries, other banks, Canada, Brazil, Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong. This is kind of an issue in which many countries are trying to take the lead, and we see heterogeneity between the banks. For example, the Fed, the US, for example, is not considering this for the moment, okay? And then how we do this, okay? And I tell you, this is going to be, in my opinion, a very important topic because it's going to be done often. This can have consequences, okay? And I want to tell you a little bit also from academia how we think on this, because I think it's going to be very complicated to do this. I think the intuition is very nice. We have traditional stress testing. Traditional stress testing after the financial crisis, the idea is, if you look the financial crisis that happened in 2018, it started in 2008, 2009, and in Europe it lasted a long time, we know it has to do with liquidity and capital of the financial sector. So the idea of the traditional stress testing is, let's see how the liquidity and capital of the financial institutions is going to evolve under different kind of scenarios. And the scenarios of traditional stress testing is kind of recessions, GDP falls by different percentages, or a financial crisis. What if this happens in markets and maybe you don't have access to liquidity? And then you give these scenarios, you apply some risk management tools, and then you get to conclusions on how weak or strong is the financial institution. And the idea is to do the same with climate stress tests. What is the problem? I'm going to show you today many reasons why this is not obvious how this is going to take place. So far, all the plans about climate stress testing is to be kind of more a descriptive exercise, okay? The plan is not to publish the individual bank information. So the Bank of France has not published all the detailed information. It's kind of more think on the system. The ECB didn't publish also kind of very detailed information. It's kind of, let's not put names on the table. And the reason not to put names is because markets can react to names, and given the uncertainties that are here, you have to be careful. My feeling is that as we go on, it's very likely that if regulators feels that the banks and the financial sectors are not behaving in the way they want, we are going to start seeing kind of more actions associated with this test. That's why I believe it's very important that I think this is an area in which we need a lot of collaboration between policymakers, academia, and the industry. But I think it's going to be very important that we get ways to do this that make sense, because restrictions on capital, restrictions on payouts, market reactions, these are important events, okay? And I think we need to be sure that we are not just with good work. You know the sentence that says, hell is full of good intentions, okay? You can have good intentions, but you need to do them very carefully. And I'm very concerned about this area, I have to say. Let me give you an idea of what's the plan for Europe, okay? And if you read the ECB publications these past weeks, you see very clear the plan. So the plan is, first you need to start with the scenarios. You need to have scenarios for climate change. Now we have a consensus, more and more, the scenarios are going to come from this link that is called the Network of Central Banks and Supervisors for Greening the Financial System. If you are into this kind of area, it's called NGFS. Once you start reading all the reports from these institutions, you see tons of abbreviations, so it's a bit hard. I call this like a group of central banks started with this. It was leading by the Central Bank of France, that's where France has been the leader. And basically, what is very interesting is that you can go and you see in this webpage the data scenarios. You can go there and download the data, and they have classified 3 kind of climate change scenarios. What they call the hot house war. This is the worst thing that can happen if we don't implement policies. Then what they have called the orderly transition is kind of things go very well, we are going to move to a situation in which we prevent kind of climate risk, and then the one in the middle that is kind of our disorderly scenario, okay? And my feeling is that because central banks, especially the ECB, likes these scenarios a lot, because we have important players involved in this network of central banks, and because the data are there, I would be surprised if they don't become this kind of the scenarios we need to discuss. And I tell you, when you have a risk like climate change, the first thing is what kind of risk we are thinking. So this is the scenarios. Now you need to say what these scenarios, that is how nature will change, what kind of risk we have to be dealing with, okay? And here there is a consensus that there are 3 main types of risk. Europe is going to be at this moment focused on 2 of them. And if you look at the previous stress tests, not all of them are taking care of them. The ECB, the last week and published, was the first one to try really to take seriously what we call physical risk and transition risk. Physical risk is if the climate change is going to have consequence, okay, like weather hazards, sea level rise, what are the effects from those physical hazards? That's physical risk. Second one is transition risk, is that the economy is going to change. And the change in the economy is very unpredictable. If you are seeing the energy crisis that is happening these days in many countries, there is a relation with some of the policies. If you see carbon permits prices are increasing, okay? So the idea of transition risk is let's try to measure anything that can happen during the transition to the sustainable society, because we are changing the industries that produce. Okay? And as you can see from this idea of the energy, if you read these reports, we are not thinking really on the energy prices and energy cost. Okay? It's not what policymakers were thinking, but if you are seeing the data of these past weeks, you notice it's a big issue. Okay? And then but I think regulators, and we hope from the previous speech, they understand that we need to think about these 2 kind of risk, and I think my forecast, and I tell you, like an academic, is that we are going to see these 2 types of risk in the stress testing. What is the third type of risk that in Europe we are ignoring so far in all the regulators? What we call liability risk. Liability risk is that some financial player, they are involved in financing or in collaborating with some activities, and somebody takes them to the tribunals and say, look, this happened because you were putting your money or you're giving advice, and then you are responsible for this. Maybe this is more of a case in situations like in the US, in which you can usually go to court and you can create a big judicial issue, but in Europe these things can happen. It's potentially a liability risk, but this is being ignored. Why this is being ignored? Well, the most important reason is because it's very hard with the physical and transition, so if you think liability risk, it's even harder. Okay, so I think the idea, and I think this is a wise step, is this is the two risks that are being measured. And I want to give you examples from the ECB last day, because you can see. This is now how the ECB is thinking about physical risk in Europe. So this is a map of Europe, in which you can see here on the legend the different kind of physical hazards. You have flooding, okay, you have fire, you have sea level rise, and the ECB and like the board member stressed, the problem here is data. Okay, these things are hard to measure, they can be measured in different ways, and now we have kind of a bottleneck, because if you see the ECB calculations are based on a database that is a private sector company, 427, that is now belongs to Moody's. Moody's bought 427, that these guys, what they try to do is to quantify the physical risk of every company. If you have worked with data, this is very hard. Pick a multinational company, or pick a company that has multiple places where they produce and sell. How you do it? Some of these databases are based on the address of the company. But if you know many countries, the address is in a nice location, but the company produces in another. Okay, so you see there are a lot of judgment calls in constructing things, and I think we need much more opening from the industry to academics. Okay, I really think this is going to be very important. Okay, because we need to see how these things are created. If you see this, what do you notice? The first thing you notice, interesting, that France is one of these countries And you don't see, there are not too many kind of very tons of dots at risk and France. You see Portugal is the opposite. See Portugal, how exposed is to especially sea level rise, okay? I tell you, this is the physical risk. The second reason, the set of risk is transition risk. How are regulators now doing the measure of transition risk? They're focusing especially on the carbon sector, okay? So this is, for example, the ECB that is, again, using another private sector database, is Urgentem dataset. Urgentem dataset, they try to quantify for each country. So if you see here on the left, you see different countries, right? All the European ones. You see PT is Portugal at the bottom, right? Third to the bottom, okay? And here you have the different industries. For each one of these industries, this dataset tries to quantify, okay, the exposure to carbon and the exposure to transition risk. You can see that energy prices are not here. And you would say, well, it's obvious that energy prices are being affected by this. Well, but that's why you start to feel that there is a lot of ambiguity on how to do it. But if you want to do that, you will have to quantify. So this is this kind of second set. I tell you now is being very carbon-oriented calculations, okay? And that's why you see things like mining are the parts of the sector that matters. And I think when you take regulation, it's very important the details. You see, we say evil is in the details. And I think in these topics, it's very important to pay attention to the details. And then I'm going to give you some, I do research in these areas, okay, and I have to say that I think the problems with climate stress testings are complicated, and I think at some moment we have to agree that we do one way with some problems, and the important is that at least everybody, we are honest and fair with each other, okay? I think that's what is very important. And the reason is this. When you do traditional stress testing, I think it's quite clear how to measure a GDP drop or a financial crisis now. We have so much information and so much work on it, but we don't have the same information on how climate risk affects the economy. You see, and I told you from the war line, I work on climate risk in economics, okay? And we have a lot of disagreement on how these things are going to affect. We don't know very well how climate is going to affect GDP, how it's going to affect market prices, how it's going to affect liquidity. I'm going to show you some of my work, okay, because I feel that we are discovering some things, but we have a lot of disagreements on sectors, geographies, modeling techniques, okay, and I think we ignore a lot what we call transmission channels. And then if you want to see this now in real life, because I think it's very interesting that academics now we are talking in public, I encourage you to go to the webpage of John Cochrane, okay, because John Cochrane, he was a faculty in Chicago, he's a faculty in Stanford, okay, and he belongs, if you want to say, to one extreme. The extreme is that he believes that, and you have here the citations, and he just published an article in the National Review, and here the link you can read. He says, look, climate generates a lot of local shocks, but he claims that in economies they are long-in services. Those local shocks, at the end, they are more or less kind of manageable. And I tell you, he's in an extreme, and he says, look, Oregon in the US has been suffering big heat waves. But if you see the weather in Oregon was not so different in Texas, and so far it's true that even in Germany we have this flooding. Go to see the GDP of Germany, you are not going to see a big collapse of what happened. It's also true that many of the events that are happening so far are kind of local focus. We don't know yet the situation in which a big country has flooding everywhere, okay? But if you see this, I did this, like, there is a lot of heterogeneity, okay, on how to measure these things, and especially I think what we ignore is how adaptation and technologies will help us to cope with climate change. Because if we know something about humans, it's that we adapt, that we create new technologies. Think on air conditioning, okay? Think on the Arab countries with technology they can produce and they do economy. In climate, you would say, how can you live there, okay? But the technology allows these things. So then this is important because we don't know many of these things, okay? And I tell you, this creates big heterogeneity, and I think you have to take that into account somehow. I want to discuss with you my research that focuses especially on real estate, because especially for Portugal is very important. You hear the board member, he say real estate is kind of at the focus, and I started working on this. You remember the board member, he said, we need data. Well, the US offers very good data on one location. This is a real life picture, is how I got interested on this. It's a location called Washaway Beach. Why I call Washaway Beach? Because it's an area is going to disappear. Okay, and you see pictures like this. It's really, the sea is increasing, and you see the houses falling. We don't want to be maybe too much forward-looking, but you say maybe one day in Portugal we have the same situation. You will see this kind of photos, okay? And this is the area. This is basically in the state of Washington. It's in the west part, in the Pacific Ocean, but it's very natural experiment because the Pacific Ocean there has been moving. So if you see here, this is how the sea has been gaining part of the land, and this location is called North Cove, okay? And then once I moved to Spain, I noticed that in Spain we have a similar version, okay, that is in La Manga. We don't have yet those kind of pictures, but Greenpeace published these projections. Okay, so this is a part of Spain in Murcia that has the idea that it's called La Manga. It's kind of a piece of land, you see, surrounded by two seas. And Greenpeace said, look, as soon as the water starts to go up, okay, you see that the water is inundating kind of things. These are kind of Photoshop yet situations, okay? But for me, it was very good to try to measure how do markets react to this, okay? And I have been getting some conclusions that I think is important to take into account because they go, some of them, against this idea that the central banks and the regulators have. Okay, but central banks and regulators sometimes think climate change is going to take some time, it's long in the horizon. If you see the ECB, it's an exercise on 30 years. But the data show that sometimes, even if you believe something is going to happen in 20 years, you take actions now, especially when you have markets. Okay? And in real estate markets, I'm going to show you evidence that we see jumps when you have the information. Okay? So this idea that the events that happen later, they can be felt today, I think is very important. This can happen in a very discontinuous way. I'm going to show you some data now, okay? Something we are discovering is that the amount of people who don't believe in climate change, that is non-trivial, okay? Maybe in Europe more people are convinced about this, but there are other parts of the world, especially in the US, have tons of people don't believe in vaccines and don't believe in climate change, okay? What we are discovering is that that part of the population is key for the reaction, okay, to the news of climate change. And then what are we discovering? For example, prices will change, but really what's going to change is investment. Okay, quantities. And it makes sense, right? You don't want to build in the areas that are more exposed, but you can find a price with some discount, and then we are happy to take transactions then. When you think on real estate markets, I think it's going to change the home ownership. That's something we have seen in those experiences. People want to have the summer, okay, in a very nice location, but maybe you don't want to be the owner there in case a hurricane comes or something happens and the house gets destroyed. So we are seeing a movement towards rental markets. This has big implications for the banking industry because if you are a tenant, you don't need a mortgage. Okay, so the demand for mortgages collapses in those areas. Okay, and I think this is the first factor that is not in the stress testing, but is very important for the banking industry, and especially in Portugal. Every house in Portugal with a mortgage, usually if you have a beach close, the price of the house is larger, and the mortgage has more value. Then the question is, who is going to be the owner of the coastal locations that are at risk? That's a big avenue for businesses. I think it makes sense that a well-diversified company owns a lot of real estate. You rent during the summer and the vacations, but well, if you have a disaster somewhere, you are well diversified. So I think this is going to create a lot of opportunities for real estate investment trusts. In Europe, we are developing fast, and I think this is going to be a very promising area. And I think sometimes, especially, you see, the good thing is that I am in academia and I can say what I think is the truth. Sometimes when you're in policy, you cannot say there are winners and losers. But I think it's very important to say this. Not everybody loses and not everybody wins, okay? The distributional consequences of climate change are first order, and I'm going to show you some examples. And this has a lot of implications through politics, because people vote everywhere. Okay, let me show you some data from my research. This is, for example, from La Manga. Okay, so La Manga, what happened is that in 2014, Greenpeace have been publishing this report that shows things can happen. Here I show you the prices of home ownership, prices of houses, and the rents, if you rent. If you rent, you don't care if the property is going to be inundated, okay, because you are just renting. So if you see La Manga, rentals don't react too much. But you can see this idea that this is going to happen a long time ago. If you go to La Manga, nothing is yet inundated. But you see that the market is collapsing. Okay, and this is something that I think is very important when you take this stress test, okay? Even if the exercise is 30 years like the ECB is doing, if markets get concerned, you are not going to wait 30 years for the effects. Because this is what we know from financial markets. The idiot is the last one. Okay, this is how we teach the students and how any practitioners know, right? It's like there are runs. That's for rents. And then what's interesting is you compare locations. You see prices drop in La Manga. They don't drop in other locations. And in fact, if you look at the locations closer to La Manga that are kind of considered safe, you see that the prices increase. So this is telling you climate change is bad for some areas, but is good for others. At the European level, all the data show that places like Finland, Sweden, the north of Europe is going to be a potential big winner from climate change. If you talk to the wine industry, that in Portugal is important industry, like in Spain, well, the wine industry may have to relocate, Okay? And that's why this is going to have consequences, because if you go to a meetings in the European Union, ECB, and not everybody suffers and some countries benefit, see this idea of, oh, we are all friends, it's a bit harder being friends when some wins and some loses, right? And I tell you, these are just house prices in an area in Spain, the area affected by the shock, and the area where people move, okay? And then I look at this in the US with hurricanes, and then we get things that are complicated, like for example, if you start thinking that climate risk is different across locations, you should have different prices. This, what we did here, is try to evaluate how mortgage rates should change in the US in the part that is exposed to the hurricanes. Well, you have news like in some areas should increase by 15%. 15% is a big increase, okay? So you have a lot of political pushback against these things. You see, like it's very nice to do stress testing and the green ratios, but if then the financial industry starts to apply different pricing, we are going to have the senator or the president from different areas saying, look, this is not fair, why I need to pay much more than the others? Because remember, nobody is proposing that we change the electoral systems to take into account where people should be living because of climate change. And if climate change, if the sea increases, some locations should lose population and some should win. But the electoral systems are not changing. So we are going to have a lot of interactions through politics, okay, on this, because if you follow, for example, the US is not managing to make too much progress on this kind of simulations, because people in Florida, if you see here Florida, that is a very affected area, they say, we don't want that, we want subsidies from the rest of the US, so we take the risk, okay? And I think these kind of uncomfortable questions is what I think is good to bring to the question today, because what we have seen is that it's true. The effects on defaults are first order. Like, for example, this is what happens when hurricanes come, these solid black lines were the two major hurricanes in the US, and you see that especially for the loan-to-values that are high, okay, we see a big increase in defaults. This also generates a lot of issues of inequalities, because climate change is especially complicated for the poor who cannot hedge, who cannot protect the houses, okay, who have more risk. And we are seeing this. If you see here, people who mortgages that are the loan-to-value around 60, the default is not too high. So what does this mean? If we push the financial sector to take into account climate risk, there are going to be politically incorrect measures from the finance sector. Except we believe that the financial industry has to say, we take the risk, but we don't price them accordingly, we treat everybody equally. Okay, so this means that when you think on sustainability, climate is a big issue, and it's totally related to other issues like inequality. Okay, because the inequalities related to climate are very important. So that's why when you see this presentation, I really agree with the central banks, and I agree with Europe that we have to do something. I think it's a very complex area, so at least we need to assume we do this way, it has all these limitations, and we have a conversation to improve. What I don't like is that we see now a lot of black boxes, okay? And we see a lot of models that predict numbers, okay? And as I say, the evil is in the details, okay? And that's a very dangerous path, and hopefully it's not the path we follow, okay? And I think for that we are going to need a lot of cooperation between the academia, the policymakers, and the industry, and events like this one. I think these kind of conferences are very important, okay, because we need to discuss what's going on. So this was kind of what I tried to do in this presentation.
We'll now begin question and answer, and also with our other panelists who are remote today. And leading the panel for this question and answer session will be moderator André Mestre from Microsoft. Thank you very much. André, if you'd like to take the floor.
Thanks. Professor, first of all, thank you so much. It was a very insightful presentation. I'm not sure if Sofia, Carla, and Isabel, if they can hear us. I hope so. Or if you can bring them on screen, maybe. Okay, here we go. Isabel, Carla, Sofia. I'm not sure if they can hear us. Well, while we wait, maybe we can start the two of us, and then we hope that they can join us. Professor, again, thank you so much for the introduction. It was a very, very interesting presentation. I would maybe start by asking you a question based on what on some topics you discussed. You talked about a lot about the differences between what we are seeing in Europe, what we are seeing in the US, and it's also true that we are seeing similar kind of events in other areas of the world. It's also true that regulations are different in the US, they are different in Europe. Now we have the Brexit and the FCA and so on, which is even creating some silos inside some of the regions. You talked a lot about the transition risks and the carbon emissions and the goals that we are setting, especially here in Europe. And it seems that the carbon credits are being, we have more supply, or we have more demand. It looks like, especially in Europe, we are kind of lacking in the supply, which makes prices go up. And I'm not going to say that we are entering a speculatory kind of market, but it seems that we might be going that way. It also seems that in other areas of the world, there might be more ability to actually produce those kind of credits, which means that the market will probably be a very global market. How do you see entities like the regulators collaborating with each other across the world? Because it seems like it's not going to be enough to have regulation in Europe, to have regulation in the US, regulation in Asia or Singapore or whatever. It looks like sometime sooner or later, and maybe sooner than later, we will need to have a kind of a global kind of collaboration between the regulators so that we can, especially in those carbon risks, to actually make the market to be a little bit more equal, I would say. How do you see that evolving? I think you have the mic. Yeah.
Well, these are very good questions because the truth is that climate has a problem of what we call externalities. It means that if you pollute in one place, affects other locations. The short-term cost of the transition to the green economy are costs. So this creates a big incentive of being the last one adapting those costs and let other countries kind of take the policies. And this we are seeing. If you see now all the situation is that there are a lot of meetings and every country speaks and say we are going to do. But then who is the first one who suffers some of those costs, right? In Europe now, we are taking the lead. If you see the elections in Germany, the people spoke very in favor of climate policies, and I think this is going to be an important issue, okay? I think the German elections show... Okay, thank you. I think the German elections show that at least people in Germany and in many other countries in Europe, we are willing, okay, to take the lead, even if some countries are free riding on us. And I think potentially there is ability to retaliate on some things. Like, for example, there are some proposals now discussed at the European Parliament of let's relate taxes on imports and exports, okay, to the carbon policies of the country. If you are a polluter, maybe when you export goods, you should pay a tax when you come to Europe. I think those things are good ideas. In the same way that I think this kind of market cap with carbon is good because you create incentives. And this is basically what we are learning from economics. You need to generate the incentives for people to do things. I think that's a good idea, and I think at some moment we'll have to do this kind of policies, and especially trade is the way to impose discipline across countries. Otherwise, you are not going to go to war because a country doesn't want to adopt some policies, right? But you can say, well, if you want, you do what you want, but you don't trade with us. Okay, I think that's where we are moving. But it's complicated because you have big ones like China and the US that they are not so enthusiastic like Europe, right? And if you follow the economy, you see I study in the US, I have a lot of interactions now with Asia, and Europe is important, but we are kind of a little bit, you see, we are a little bit losing ground relative to other parts of the world. So I think it's important we lead, but we'll have to do policies with them and convince them.
Definitely. Thanks. I'm not sure if Carla or Sofia or Isabel, if you can hear us. No?
Isabel can.
Isabel can?
Yeah.
Isabel, can you hear us? Okay. Okay.
But I think we are having problems here on the connection. We have Sophia here.
Sophia? Yes? Sophia, can you hear us? Maybe she can, but we cannot hear her, probably. Okay, so while we
We keep talking.
Yeah, we keep talking. The both of us.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure.
Why would you remove from the green ratio, why would you remove supranational sovereigns and all that?
Oof, now we enter into complicated questions because there are a lot of politics, right? To start with, you know that in banking regulation, usually the risk weights for government debts, they tend to be zero, right? Why? Because governments don't want to say my bonds are very risky when I do for banks. So you see, these kind of questions have to do a lot with, you see, with this kind of political incentives. One problem, let's think on what can happen. Different countries and different banks have different exposures to government debt. Okay, in countries with a lot of debt, well, banks usually have more exposure, right? Do you want, first you need to put a taxonomy to government debt. You want to say that the debt of Spain is greener than the debt of France, or the opposite, because maybe Spain has a government that is doing things. You agree the problems that, I mean, we have people from the embassy assume that your country gets a bad treatment. How do you deal with it, right? So I think the complications of that game is one of the reasons that maybe at the beginning they leave them out. I agree with you that given the importance of sovereign exposures in Europe, because the financial system is very exposed to this, it's not clear, but how are you going to put a green or brown label on countries? I think the first idea is all government debt is the same, right? We are all very green. Okay, that's usually how these things are agreed at the government level, right? But then that's a problem, because then you create also a strong incentive to go to government debt. So I think the idea here is, why don't we try to start with the private sector, that maybe we can measure it better. But I agree with you, if you are trying to see how green you are, you should do the full picture, because otherwise don't take pictures.
I don't think it's even that. I think that if you make that an important point, then you indirectly force governments to be proactively green.
Exactly, but who is going to be analyzing and measuring and evaluating governments and putting a number, right? If you see these things in Europe, I mean, we have rules about the debt that a country can take, and you know that France violated the rules, and then France says, it's okay, we need to make exceptional, right? Exceptional times. So this is the same. Who is going to be the ECB? Is going to be grading how green is Spain or how green is France? That's room for disaster. I mean, maybe the European Commission, but the European Commission, as you know, you see, is not very, very strong relative to the countries, right? And
one way is to have, like you have a government debt, you have the credit rating done by agencies. So third-party agencies that...
I think that's where a little bit we're going. If you see who are the sources of information for a lot of these exercises, well, the private sector. What I think is important is that the private sector has to do this in multiple ways, right? Because, for example, I would love to be able to see some of these data sets, but they are private. You need to pay, and you don't see all the details. It's like the sausages, right? You know the sentence of you only see the sausage, not how it's made. I think here we need to do the details of how these estimates are produced, right? And the private sector, they have also a strong incentive of, I do this, but I'm not going to tell you everything how I do it, because otherwise you just do it. I think at some moment we'll need to develop public institutions measuring these things in a very transparent way. The data will public. If he wants to do it and check, he can check. We need to have many more events like this one, in which I can come with my slides and say, look, sorry, what the board member of the central bank said, I show you the data and it's totally different. So either he's wrong or I am wrong. Let's look at the data. And I think this kind of open data policies is where we should go. It's the only way, but starting for everybody. But the politics, I think it makes complicated, right? It's like, that's why I agree with the central bank is that maybe at the beginning it's good to move. And then we fix these things later. Because if not, we just spend our time fighting and we don't do anything, right?
Good, thanks. I think now we have Carla or Sofia. Or maybe not.
Another question? Yeah?
Professor, you referred a wide range of risks, mainly focused on governments, financial institutions. My question is, one of the most accurate risk managers that are rely on insurers and reinsurers. How do you see the role that those institutions can play in the overall risk mitigation or discovery in terms of this huge problem that we are facing related with sustainability and green path and so on?
I think it's first order. if you think we are talking about risk, so the sector dealing with risk is insurance. So I think this is by far the first sector there. I think the question we need to ask is, you know that you cannot insure any type of risk. That's why if you see risk, they are out of policies, because there are, if climate change becomes a systemic risk, in the sense that some disasters are very big and affect everybody, then we are not going to be able to insure them. If you see the US, that is good to see this, hurricanes that happen very often, you see the insurance industry is not insuring most of the flood risk in the US. It's basically a government agency, FEMA, that is bankrupt because so far they were not doing pricing correctly and they don't manage to cover cost. So I think what we need to discuss is we need the insurance industry, we need to have conversations with the insurance industries to see what can they insure, what can they cover, are they safe if the because what we don't want is to have, in fact, my opinion, if you think about the major crisis related to climate change, it can go through the insurance industry. Okay? Think that you have hurricanes in places you are not expecting. Like think maybe in the Portugal or Spain. And then suddenly you have major losses for insurance companies, and then you have one of them that they collapse. I think that's potentially academics, what we believe can create kind of a big issue, and this kind of conversations of what insurance is systemic to what risk, I think that's what is very important to take. And then I think insurance policies, by charging different premiums, they have a lot of potential to do things better than banks. Okay, because banks at the end, what can you do? I give you credit, I don't give you credit, maybe how much I charge you. But I think banks should say, why don't you talk to the insurance first? Okay, so I think the insurance sector is very important. And I have to say, in honor of the insurance industry, they are really doing a lot of things. There are several web pages of data, okay, they are publishing tons of reports. So I think it's a very key sector. My take is that if the catastrophic projections, what they call the hot wall appear, the insurance sector cannot manage many shocks at the same time, right? But until we get there, I think I would encourage to push much more on the private sector to take policies, okay, with the guidance of the public sector.
Let's try again. Let's see if we can, if we can
connect.
hear Carla or Sofia or Isabel. Well, we can see Carla.
Good.
Good starting point. And now I can hear myself, which is also good.
No, I just switched the sound on mine.
Maybe they can write in the chat and you tell us the questions, if not.
Hello, Isabel. Yeah, we can see you, but we cannot hear you. Still. Well, let's keep on talking maybe while they fix
It's
it.
coming closer.
Isabel, did you specific links that they sent you, not just join the Zoom call? Yeah, okay.
So does this mean that we can hear Isabel? No?
Yeah, we are here in the live, so she has sound there.
You can hear me, can you?
Yes! I think you were on mute. We couldn't be here with people on a conference call not saying you were on mute because it's something that we need to say. So I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for joining and thank you for being here with us. I would like to maybe start by asking you. So you work for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. You recently communicated plans to becoming a majority a green bank by 2025. Maybe I would start by asking if you can comment on the meaning of being a green bank or only a green bank, and what are the main pillars that support that kind of strategy, which is fairly new in the market, I would say.
So can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much So what it means by being a majority green bank is that we're aiming for at least 50% of all our lending in any business year of our new lending to be green. So be part of what we call the green economy transition. And that is broader than just climate, but that also includes climate. And in addition, this year, we have announced that we are looking to have all our financial flows Paris aligned. Direct flows that we have and direct projects are starting to be assessed for Paris alignment now. The indirect will be done from next year. We are working towards a methodology on that. So the multilateral development banks, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and others have agreed a, a joint framework for how to think about Paris alignment. And that's based on alignment with the mitigation goals. So, scrutinizing operations and financial products for how they are consistent with low emission development pathways that are compatible with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. It's also to look at the same projects and financings from an adaptation perspective to make sure that they are climate resilient, looking at the risks that we've been discussing this morning. Then is the aspect that I mentioned before, which is increasing the finance, scaling up climate finance to help support the NDCs. And then there's another building block, which is about strategy, engagement, and policy development. So working with our clients and in our countries in order to put in place long-term strategies for low emissions and climate resilient development. The fifth pillar is about reporting, trying to develop tools and methods for monitoring and reporting on aligned activities. And the sixth is looking at all internal activities. So that means things like procurement, it means things like the pension, it means things like treasury. So the starting point has been that we've agreed effectively a list of what absolutely can be deemed aligned to start with and what must be deemed non-aligned to start with. And then every detailed process of assessment. In terms of what is aligned, things like, renewable energy are deemed to be aligned. Things like district heating, as long as they give negligible life cycle GHG emissions, are deemed aligned. And other different aspects like manufacturing that is enabling, so very much in consistency with the EU taxonomy, that enables, for instance, the components that are needed for renewable energy and energy efficiency are deemed aligned where they're non-energy intensive. And then we've got water, wastewater, we've got waste management, agribusiness that's working on afforestation and reforestation, emissions, agriculture and climate smart agriculture and so on, that are deemed automatically aligned. On transport as well, trying to help with the development of electric and non-motorized urban mobility and the infrastructure for transport. There's something on buildings, on IC, research and development, and general services. What is automatically deemed non-aligned is mining of thermal coal and extraction of peat, and the any electric power generation by either coal or peat. So that gives the sort of general framework. And then we have much more specific assessments that need to be done for all of this on climate resilience, but also where things aren't automatically deemed aligned or non-aligned, they have to pass other specific assessments. So look whether they're consistent with the NDCs and low carbon pathways, whether they create carbon lock-in, and also looking at the economic viability, so using shadow carbon pricing. So that's essentially the way that we are, in our view, predominantly green bank. It's doing more in terms of green projects, but also this assessment throughout all our business.
Thank you, Isabel. We can now hear you loud and clear, so thank you for, for the answer. Carla, I'm not sure if you can hear us, or if we can hear you.
Hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yes, now we can.
Thank you. Carla, well, thanks for joining us and welcome to the panel. So I'll maybe ask you, so BBVA has a strong sustainability strategy, widely communicated to the public in general and to your customers. You are part of the founding members of the Principles for Responsible Banking promoted by the UN, so a lot of work going on there. Maybe you can comment a little bit on what are the current goals for BBVA, what's the strategy around sustainability, and what are you planning to actually continue doing in this area?
First of all, good morning all. Thank yourself and this panel in particular. Like you said, Andre, BBVA is a pioneer in the sustainability world. Not only was one of the 30 founding entities of the Principles of Responsible Banking, but was also one of the first banks starting helping their clients with sustainable finance solutions. For example, in Portugal, BBVA was a pioneer in 2019 in financing the first green bond with Navigator, among others. In the last 2 years, it has reinforced its commitment through multiple actions, adhesions, and alliance with supranational organizations. The responsible banking principles are response to align the banking business with long-term goals that integrate social environmental challenges. In these 2 years, BBVA consolidated itself and made sustainability a strategic pillar for the bank, marked by very relevant stages, all within the scope of the implementations of the 6 principles of the United Nations. First, by advancing in the alignments of its strategies with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. The bank has carried out a strategic review process, following which it has made sustainability one of its 6 strategic priorities, placing at the core of its business. Can you hear me?
Can you ask headphones or switch off the sound?
Hello?
Carla, can you turn off your PC sound? The volume? Because we can hear you with some feedback, so maybe if you turn off the volume. No.
Yeah.
You have headphones or something that you can turn on? Carla? Maybe we can try Sophia. Isabel, you can still hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, and I think I hear.
Carla, can you
I
try
can
now?
hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, a lot better.
Because I'm hearing with feedback.
Carla, can you turn off Zoom? So you need to be just on in one of the two links.
Yeah, but can you hear me like that?
Yes, we can perfectly.
Oh, okay. Because previously you can. That's why I have to connect by the Zoom. Okay,
Yeah,
so
now it's perfect.
let's hope it works from now.
Yeah, it works. If you can just go like 30 seconds back into what you were saying because we kind of lost you.
Okay.
You were talking about the principles for responsible banking
Yeah,
when we lost you.
I know, I know. I will try to resume. So, I think I was mentioning that the BBVA has carried out the strategic review process, following which it has made sustainability one of the six strategic priorities. Okay, so our objective is to help and accompany our customers in the transition to a sustainable future. And to do so, we offer advice and sustainable solutions based on the SDGs and also ensure the necessary investment to tackle climate change and the 2013 agenda. Secondly, by ensuring social and environmental impact management in the most sensitive areas, setting ambition targets. The bank also identifies and assesses the impact, risk, and opportunities related to climate change and sustainability in general. In this sense, BBVA has taken important steps in the last 2 years. Among them, its 2025 pledge to channel 200 billions between 2018 and 2025 in sustainable finance, doubling the amount established in the initial target. And that is because in June of 2021, we already channel 67 million euros. So the decisions to stop financing companies with coal-related activities or the net zero 2050 commitment, which implies zero net CO2 emissions in that year, considering both the bank direct emissions, in which it has already been neutral since 2020, and indirect emissions, those of the customers' expenses. Today, the bank's activities in the area of sustainability continues to grow. In June of this year, BBVA joined the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, an alliance to measure indirect impacts and evaluate carbon emission financed by banks. And at the same time, all actions related to carbon footprint reductions are included in BBVA updated environment and social framework in line with Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change proposal to limit the rise in temperature to a maximum of 1.5 Celsius degrees and with the aim to at achieving a carbon neutral economy by 2050. These achievements, among others, have led BBVA to be considered the most sustainable bank in Europe and the second most sustainable in the world, according to Dow Jones Sustainability Index. As for the third principle on customer relations, BBVA is developing financial solutions to accompany them in these transitions. These solutions are already of relevance to the wholesale market and are progressively advancing to help SMEs and individuals customers. BBVA currently has a catalog of sustainable alternatives for all its products in Spain and will continue along this path in the rest of the territories in which we operate. We also have third parties calculate the amount of greenhouse gases they emit into the atmosphere through their daily activities. In fact, we were the first bank in Spain to provide its customers, both individuals and companies, with a tool to calculate their carbon footprints thanks to data analytics, which already is available at Portugal also. Furthermore, and in line with its commitment to responsible use and recycling of recycled materials, BBVA will offer recycled cards in all the countries in which it operates by the end of this year. And by 2023, the bank will no longer issue any other type of cards. We will deliver up to 7.3 million of these cards to our customers at the end of this year, a progressive process by segment and by country. Both Portugal and Spain, to date, all new cards issued by us are recycled. The bank has also progressed in the dialogue with all its stakeholders, force principle, as you know, especially with regulators, supervisors, and civil society organizations. All this with the aim of being an active actor in the definitions of the new global architecture that is being created in the field of sustainable finance. In this regard, and it's worth highlighting the consolidations of BBVA position, occupying the co-chairmanship of the UNEP-FI steering committee and participating in the initiative to promote the voluntary carbon markets together with IIF. Also of note, the participation as a founding member of the Zero Banking Alliance, coalitions of banks, sorry, sorry, a coalitions of banks committed to ensuring that all of their credits and investment portfolios are neutral in net emissions by 2050, in which BBVA forms parts of its steering committee. At the collective level and within the framework of the principles of responsible business, another important advancement has been the creations of the Civil Society Advisory Council, a body that provides UNEP-FI with an independent contrasting vision for the implementing the principles of key issues such as climate change, biodiversity and ecosystem, human rights, poverty, social inclusion, and transparency. This council, unique in this type of initiative, does become a key element in giving principles of responsible banking the utmost credibility. In fifth place, and in terms of governance and culture, BBVA made sustainability a strategic priority in 2020, and the board approved the group's sustainability policy, a policy whose implementation is supervised by the council itself. The next step was to launch a global sustainability office that same year. To consolidate this commitment, in June 2021, the group created a global sustainability area, which elevates sustainability to the highest executive level of the organization. At the time, all when all the group's employees and units already integrate sustainability into their daily work, the new area will design the strategic sustainability agenda, define and promote the lines of work in this area in the different global and transformation units like risk, talent and culture, data, among others, and develop the new sustainable products. And to finish, talk about the sixth principle, the relations to transparency. The bank has been reporting on its responsible banking policies for years in its reports to regulators, identifying improvements and plan for their full implementation. A good example of this is the second presentation of the TCFAD report in 2020, an exercise in transparency that includes progress in the governance models, strategy, risk management, and climate change related metrics. In this sense, BBVA has joined the commitment to publish ESG metrics measuring stakeholder capitalism initiatives adopted by 61 members companies of the World Economic Forum in Davos and the group of top executives that form parts of its International Business Council. To resume, the principles for responsible banking are therefore more than a declaration. They are a true guide with very concrete ambitions and at the same time very distinctive steps compared to other collected initiatives to help the financial sector in its transformation toward the responsible and sustainable banking model.
Thank you, Carla. Thanks. Sophia, can you hear us now? Let's see if now.
I can hear you. Can you?
Yes, we can hear you. Well, thank you.
Yes.
Sophia, just maybe for the sake of time and to make it easier, maybe I'll just maybe try to join here 2 or 3 questions in just one. Crédito Agrícola is a bank that historically has been also doing lots of work in the area of sustainability. you just recently launched the carbon calculator for your digital banking customers, which is an excellent example on how you are trying to actually also impact the way your customers look at sustainability. So I'll maybe ask you to maybe just comment a little bit on what's the bank vision, what's the strategy you have in place, how you see this evolving, and how do you see yourself as a bank contributing not only for your own sustainable practices, but also to, in a way, to influence also your customers in this sense. Sophia? Sophia?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay,
Did you hear the question?
So, yes, I did.
Yes,
I did.
good.
So very
Thanks.
quickly, very quickly, I mean, Credit Agricole has been developing its own sustainability strategy and has a sustainability policy that is available on the website. That sustainability policy indicates the level of ambition of becoming, of course, recognized as being one of the sustainable banks in Portugal. One thing is to have an ambition, the other thing is actually to be able to do things that you need to be doing in terms to be perceived as that ambition. And for the banking sector, it's really hard work to become a sustainable bank. It demands a lot of changes internally in terms of how you are going to incorporate environmental, social, and governance risks in your analysis. How are you going to get the information that the previous speakers spoke about in terms of to be able to respond to the green asset ratio? You need to get data, and for a bank like Credit Agricole, most of the clients are SMEs and are not the listed SMEs, so SMEs and micro companies that at the moment they do not have any obligation to report any kind of information close to the taxonomy demands. So because of that, what we have been doing is actually trying to get this information, and I think that's really relevant in a way that since July, we have established some questionnaires so that every company that is requesting for a loan needs to fulfill some questionnaires so that we have a first idea about how the company has sustainability incorporated in its daily management, and also how the company includes the sustainability issues in that particular project. And this has been very well received by the clients because, okay, it's more information that you have to fill in, but the thing is, we believe that we are helping our clients to become more prepared to many other information requests that will be coming soon from the regulators, from public available money, from the European Commission that then comes into the national programs. And so I would say that we have been doing different things. We also have calculated the CO2 emissions from scope 1 and 2 from all of our caixas. So we are talking about more than 70 physical place calculated CO2 emissions from that. We have the questionnaires, we are aligning the best we can the taxonomy with these questionnaires, and we are changing as well many of the internal policies to include the ESG factor. Lots of training internally, and soon we will also start to provide with training and information to our clients about how important it is for them to also start having sustainability practices implemented. So, you know, I would say that as a cooperative bank that is really close to the real economy and to the small companies, what we are trying to do is also something very practical in terms of helping the companies to understand why these issues are relevant, why they also need to have their own sustainability policies, and why they also need to start to collect and disclose data, not just because we as a bank, we also need that data, but most of the other funders in terms of public funding, as I already said, and other investors will also need to have access to that information. So I think, our main goal has been to internally to change the culture and the meaning of what is the purpose of a bank that is also basically that is lending money to projects that can create prosperity within the society, so decreasing environmental impact and increasing social well-being, and at the same time passing this message to our clients. And of course, this was one example with this app that is able on this platform that is able to calculate the CO2 emissions, and soon we will have other different also tools that will be able to help consumers to better understand their environmental impact, but above all to try to consumers to also to change their behavior. So in a nutshell, I would say that this is the most relevant topics. Of course, some green products are being constructed as well, because that also makes sense, and because we need also to supply information about which products have some kind of green perspective. So it has been interesting because, of course, it's a multi-area project within a bank where basically everyone is involved.
Thank you. Thank you, Sofia. So with that, I think that we are a little bit over time now. So I would like to thank everyone on the panel, Isabel, Carla, Sofia, and also Professor Pedro here on stage with me. And I hope it was a good conversation to everyone. And I think we will see each other later on during the day. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Andre, very much for your moderation of this, very professional moderation of this particular panel. We were supposed to have a coffee break, but time must march on, unfortunately. And I know some of you are very busy and have to leave to your lives and your jobs. So we're going to move ahead with the next panel, which is Workshop 2, Measuring Sustainability Using the Power Data. And just a moment. Okay. Now, we've all heard a lot about greenwashing, and obviously there's a lot of companies these days that feel the need and want to project a greener image in the marketplace. And there are particular large multinationals that have a vested interest in doing so, particularly those in cleaning products, washing products, and those companies are well known. So there is this need for companies and organizations to put forward ecological arguments to provide a responsible image and to build trust among the public and all stakeholders. And the role of data in establishing this trust is absolutely vital if these companies want to deliver products and services and to get the capital allocation that they need to impact those projects and services. And of course, it's absolutely correct too that the financial services sector has to screen very, very carefully regarding the allocation of that capital to make sure that in fact it's not just greenwashing, it is real, they really are green projects. And with that, I would like to pass on to the next panel, the group of panelists here. And opening the session will be Richard Pears, who is from Responsible Risk Finextra. We have Afonso Salema, who is the Managing Director of Pioneer Point Partners. We have Beth Burks, Director of Sustainable Finance at Standard & Poor's Global Rating. We have Janine Dow, Direct Sustainable Finance, Fitch Ratings. Pedro Porfirio, Finastra Global Head of Capital Markets. Todd Bridges, Arabesque Bank Global Head of Sustainable Invest and ESG. And our moderator for today will be Barbara Silva, who is the editor of Capital Verde Echo. And for those that you don't know, Echo is an online news agency here in Portugal. Thank you.
Acho que somos só nós dois aqui.
Não vale a pena estar.
Vamos sentar mais perto, não é?
Exato.
Good morning to you all, and welcome to workshop number 2 of this second edition of Green Finance Forum 2021. For this next panel, we will be debating the topic measuring sustainability using the power of data, as my predecessor already explained. And to help with this discussion, we have here with us a luxury panel. We will start with the opening remarks from Richard Pierce, Responsible Risk at Finextra, and then follow to the discussion with Afonso Salema, Managing Director of Pioneer Point Partners, Pat Burks, Director of Sustainable Finance, S&P Global Rating, Janine Dow, Senior Direct Sustainable Finance Fitch Ratings, Pedro Porfirio, Head of Capital Markets, Finastra Global, Todd Bridges, Head of Sustainable Arabesque Group. So I will give the floor to Richard Pierce, that will be doing the opening remarks. I believe he's joining us online.
I'm here, if you can hear me.
Yes, hello, welcome.
Thank you. And if I, excuse me, if I could see the slides, please. Let me know when you're putting those up, or if there's any problem, I can obviously talk without slides. Just let me know what you'd like me to do.
Okay, I have been told that they are putting the slides on.
Thank you.
Thank you. want to start, and then if you sort out the slides, you will pick up from there. What's more comfortable to
Absolutely.
you? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to carry on. So just
Thank you.
feel free.
Thank you.
To peers, I'm from Responsible Risk. I had a long career at Microsoft, and I'm also contributing editor at Finextra on sustainable finance. And our focus for a number of years has been specifically around data. Our panel today is about measuring sustainability using the power of data. So I will just make some opening remarks prior to obviously the panel of experts. Essentially, I was here last year and I showed a slide which I will try and describe to you. It was essentially a view of the PCFD implementation path starting from 2018 and a 5-year time frame coming to around now, where the comment was more complete, consistent, and comparable information needs to be available for market participants to increase transparency and appropriate pricing of climate-related risks and opportunities. As we've heard from all of the speakers this morning, that still is an aspect that remains to be somewhat of a challenge at this stage. Thank you. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the image that I was just talking about as the flashback to 2020. If you press the next button, it will progress the build of the animation. Thank you. I also presented this, which was a view of the past, present data, which missing information around ESG, financial reporting only largely being the case. And at the time, I was predicting that we would be hearing a lot about potential greenwashing based on the fact that it's just corporate disclosures and there's a low number of firms actually reporting. And obviously that has manifested itself very much through the press in the course of the last certainly 6 months, where greenwashing is very much one of the main topics. What I predicted last year is that we needed to move to independent, science-based, real-time predictive data from a much wider range of sources than just disclosure, and that we need veracity of our ESG claims. So what I want to talk about today is essentially trust. I think it's really important that when we talk about data and we talk about the meaning of that data and the execution of that data to allocate capital to green projects, that really what we're talking about at the moment is a crisis of trust. If we don't get past this moment where greenwashing is becoming such an important topic in the press, we will struggle to get the trust of consumers. And obviously, people like Greta Thunberg yesterday talking, as she did with her blah, blah, blah phrase, is quite accurate in the sense of the consumer not seeing real veracity and quality of execution in the market. Next slide, please. So that was a challenge flashback from last year. But I want to show you here, this is a build. So it's going to be a little bit complicated. But we've heard about biodiversity. And what I want to use this to do is to highlight how the data problem is only going to get more complex if we carry on thinking about it the way we're doing today. We heard earlier this morning from the governor in the Bank of Portugal about ecosystem services, natural capital, and biodiversity. And this slide represents that. Next build, please. At the bottom, what I was just showing is the stakeholders, civil society, consumers, academia, we've heard from them, media, government, all demanding that we also take into account in the financial system, we take into account biodiversity. And here's a simplistic view of the financial service markets: equity, debt, asset owners, asset managers, banks, covering all sorts of different areas, and now having to build solutions for natural capital, social capital, yet still make these bankable projects. The corporates are being asked to disclose low carbon, biodiversity, SDG aligned, profitable projects, and more data on nature. And if we build again, what we're finding is in the next build layer, if you could just, thank you, is that the intermediaries, such as the policy, legal, financial markets infrastructure, data providers, are all scrambling to understand the requirements being put on them, and many are pushing back to the corporate and saying, just fill in my form as well, please. Final build on this slide is to show you that there's more technology coming. We could press the build again, please. Is that we are now seeing satellite data, sensor data, complex Earth systems modeling, cloud and artificial intelligence data all being fed into the risk modeling systems of these institutions. So my point of showing this is that if we want to have system thinking, we need to start to understand the totality of the world that we're playing with. And my assertion is really that if we want to have a trustworthy system, it needs to be based on transparency. But that transparency also needs to, the system needs to also understand that having one size fits all, standardized taxonomy, serve, and the systems are not necessarily going to serve this huge volume of data that's coming to being presented to us. Next slide, please. So I leave with some thoughts on how we actually address this. We, as we're hearing, we need to actually have clear insight. We don't just need data. We do need high quality veracity of data, knowing its source. We need insight so that we can make the right risk decisions. The only ways we're going to do this is if we have digital transformation so that we can actually pick up data around the world, manage huge volumes, and being able to do it securely and report on that data. So it needs to be secure, it needs to be shareable across supply chains, across banking partners, across regulators. It needs to have meaning attached to it. You need to know what that data means through things like semantic web, things like data passports. But then we need to turn that data and that meaning into trusted action. So we need to be clear that when we say to people that we have invested their money, that we are able to show transparency of the methodology. We need to make that available to the regulators for clear regulatory oversight. And wherever possible, we need to be using science-based, peer-reviewed, authoritative data. And all of this only leads us to the point of building the innovation we need in these long-term, very capital-intensive projects that we're going to need to do things like carbon extraction. That's going to need this forward-looking price. We're going to need the capital to be allocated to these projects so that they can get up and running, not just pledged, which is a lot of the terms we hear. And we need to be taking into consideration the circular economy. So my summary is that we have an issue of trust. It's resolvable, but we need to do it obviously through high quality data, but that data fundamentally needs to be based on meaning, which translates into action. And the only way I believe we can do this is by strong collaboration, transparency, and therefore trust. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I will start since you were very very fast. I will start with a question for you, and please join us. Because from an economic journalist point of view, we know that numbers can be easily, well, not manipulated, but seen from different perspectives, and they gain meaning from which perspective they are seen. With ESG data, that's also the case. If there is not standards and criteria equal, that every company analyzes the same by the same point of view.
Yeah, so I think that the challenge with this is that everybody resorts to everything has to be normalized and benchmarked so that it's comparable. And therefore, and of course that makes sense, right? We've all done that. But if you think that we can get to that position of everything being standardized, normalized, and regulated, we won't solve the crisis. FDR, which is of course all very laudable, and I'm not criticizing it, but you at the moment have definition issues about whether you should include gas or nuclear in the definitions of what is green or not for the EU taxonomy. There will be so many of these debates, and this is just within Europe, not taking into account America, China, etc. And then this is irrespective of what's happening in different financial quarters, whether it's in the impact industry, the sustainable industry, or just the classic commercial banking industry, for instance. So my assertion is that what we need to do is recognise that there is an asymmetry of data, as there is in so many markets. But what we need to do is to be able to ingest that data from many and various sources. We need to be able to normalise it, and then at the point where we actually report it and say we need to do the sort of weighing up of comparability, that is the point where we can use standard taxonomies and standard reporting. But where the data comes from does not need to be standardized. We just need to be transparent so that when we are queried by a regulator, we can say, this is how we calculated it, and this is where our data came from.
And how much data is needed? We don't stand the risk that too much data is overflowing, and then we are lost in too much information that then with the, as you said, with the data without any kind of action is counterproductive and offers little value.
Yeah, there is no reason for that to be the case. You know, if you look at the millions of data points that are going on every day in social media, that is being parsed down into action by the social media companies. You know, the fact that we all joke in our private lives that we think the social media companies are listening to our conversation because they're placing advertisements in front of our nose, which seem totally attuned to our last conversation. This is huge volumes of data. Now, all of these same techniques of ingestion, normalization, analytics, and then action are all known to the world of technology. And there are methods of achieving this. I work with one company that takes massive geospatial data, massive climate modeling. They reduce that down into indicators, which talk about land use, fire, water, ecological change. Those indicators are therefore much more workable for use by a portfolio manager to understand risk and make allocations. So it's all completely achievable.
Okay, thank you so much. Please keep up with us, and please join the discussion whenever you feel you feel like it. I would like to see if Janine Dow from Fitch Ratings is already with us.
Hello from London. My name is Janine Dow and I work at Fitch Ratings. I was a bank analyst for many, many years, and now I work in the Sustainable Finance Department, where I perform an analytical liaison role for global bank and financial institutions. So internally, trying to help our credit analysts understand some of the ESG developments and how these might impact on credit, and externally, liaising with investors, regulators, and stakeholders such as yourselves. So delighted to be here at this conference, and thank you for listening. I was asked to cover 3 points, 3 questions, and I will list them and then try to address them quickly in this presentation. So the first one was, what are the key priorities we need to address to improve availability and comparability of ESG data in public disclosures? Now, the topic is ESG, which is very broad, but I will focus on the E, and I will look specifically at climate change disclosure, because I think it's very topical at the moment and probably more focused for just these few minutes that we have together. So looking at the priorities, we have a number, and I think we would start at the very top. So even clearing up some basic definitions. We note, for example, that when we're looking at climate change data and disclosure, we don't even really have a global definition of what a green asset is. And this, of course, starts with confusion at the very top. Now, the EU environmental taxonomy has done much to harmonize views and to lend credibility, especially as the taxonomy is so heavily underpinned by scientific data. But the EU, big as it is only the EU. And we note that other countries are already developing or have developed their own taxonomies, and definitions are not always comparable. So something like a harmonization of a global taxonomy would probably go a long way to achieving some sort of harmonization and comparability of data and disclosures. The next priority would probably be harmonization of standards. So just as the standard setters for ECG, of which there are many, have done such praiseworthy work in terms of bringing alive and making concepts relevant that only a few years ago we wouldn't even have understood. Nevertheless, there are many such standard setters, and again, they tend to focus on different areas with different measurements and different metrics. So this is not really helpful in terms of achieving harmonization and comparability. We look at something like the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, and the guidance there has become very much an international standard. But nevertheless, again, these standards are voluntary and selective. So you can imagine that the combination of having something which is optional and users being able to pick and choose is not really the best avenue for achieving something which stakeholders globally would be able to cast their eyes on and understand how to compare and then perform their own analysis. So again, harmonization of standards, I think, is very important. Another priority for us would be simplification. And I think really here our request, our sort of plea would be shared by many users of climate change information. It would be to have one consolidated document containing all climate-related disclosure, and called something really obvious like consolidated climate change data, and labeled as such and filed on companies' websites. As users of this type of information, I'm sure stakeholders are well aware that at the moment information is presented across a very wide range of documents, and as users of that information we have to piece together information and try and put pieces into a puzzle. This is time consuming and confusing, and is really not conducive to comparable, concise analysis. Another priority for us would be to have more access to numbers. I guess as analysts, we just like working with numbers, so we would like more quantitative information. What we've seen is quite lengthy explanations, a lot of text, but very little data points that analysts are able to work with. I think in terms of the sort of presentation of reports as well, in addition to having more numbers, we would like to see more concise presentations, so potentially even a prescriptive maximum length of such documents might be user-friendly. So what type of data are we looking for? What would be our priority? And here again, I think it would be, our preference would be to have a short list of relevant, useful information which was available in the very short term, rather than holding out for something perfect, but available sometime in the much more distant future. So a short list of relevant data points across all companies globally, and we could then decide what we want to use and how. That would be our preference. So again, look, considering myself, I mean, as a bank analyst, what sort of information would we find useful if we were to make an assessment on climate change impacts for a bank, say? We would probably want to have an analysis of risk exposures. So by that we mean loan portfolios and securities portfolios, broken down by environmental points and data points. So for example, we'd like an industrial breakdown of those exposures, carbon footprint assessments of the exposures so that that would help us measure the likely impact of climate-related transition risks as companies try to adapt. We would like a geographical breakdown of these exposures because that could help us plot our expectations of climate-related physical risk. We'd like to see how management is looking at potential probability of default and loss given default on those exposures under a very limited amount of scenarios, which we could work with as well. We'd like more effort made to size the problem. So what are we really talking about? How much additional provisions are banks likely to have to make over what period of time, under what situations? And again, they could be very few and high level. So then we could try and assess what that means for financial metrics. Any sort of data points which would be provided from an environmental perspective, which we could then use to create our own scenario testing and our own stress testing and come up with our own conclusions, in this case, to help our credit analysis. Now, I'm well aware that this is a very big wish list, but I think so much time has been spent lamenting the absence of perfect data that I think it would be probably preferable if we could work with something short and sharp in the near term. So the next point I was asked to consider was how can international developments help to drive comparability and consistency of data? And I think the response here is going to be very short. So just as IFRS did so much to achieve harmonization of financial reporting globally across countries and companies, we are hopeful that the IFRS again may be able to make some very solid recommendations and provide guidelines about what would be the sort of minimum disclosure around climate change and what sort of data would be required. We know that the IFRS Foundation is consulting and building on information with external data providers and also standard setters. And this is very good news because so much groundwork has already been done by these independent consultants and companies. And I think there is quite some expectation that maybe announcements might be timed with COP26 next month. So from our own sort of user point of view, we're quite hopeful that a sort of organization with the international reach, influence and reputation such as IFRS might be able to really drive the movement forward for data disclosure and standardization. And then the third point was what disclosure is most useful to analysts and stakeholders. So again, a little bit of a repeat of what I said before. I think looking at climate change specifically, but this would go also for social issues once the market starts to focus more on these. I think we would like short, concise documents, and I think there is a requirement to be quite sort of tight in information and precise. Secondly, I think it would be helpful if companies could provide a clear explanation of what methodologies they are using. And again, I'm thinking of climate change because it is so imprecise, so uncertain, so long term. But if we had clear explanations of the methodologies as users, then we could assess whether we thought they were credible, practical, good, bad, and we could then overlay these findings with our own assumptions. And in this, I'm thinking of something like the ECB's economy-wide climate change stress test on EU banks, where the findings, and this is a top-down exercise, the findings were published in September, so last month. And I think here the methodology, the steps are very, very clearly explained. And obviously, the ECB has a wealth of data. I mean, as a regulator, it has the data as it's at its fingertips, but it does explain very clearly how it reached its conclusions and how it tied these thematic sort of considerations into potential financial impact. So we know that methodologies are going to be imprecise and imperfect, but I think if the steps are clear, this is very helpful to us. I'm thinking also of ING Bank. This is a Dutch bank, and their disclosure, their environmental disclosure, which are contained in special reports called the Terra report. They are, very, very clear in terms of what they're trying to achieve and measure and how, and also the fact that they are regularly produced allows users to monitor how progress is coming. So these are the sort of data points which we would find useful, and less information available more quickly would be preferable to perfect information provided very much out in the future. We'd also like figures which tie into financial information. Too often the figures and few data points which are available to us provided in specialist ESG reports are different or sometimes very different to what is included in the audited financial statements. And I think again this opens up room for confusion, uncertainty, lack of trust. These are not good points for ensuring comparability and standardization. In the interim, of course, we still have to work with imperfect data and continue to piece together what is being provided publicly by companies. Progress is being made, that's for sure. Even my short time in this role, I have already seen quite a lot of progress, but we certainly want to be able to compare across companies and across country. So that's all I've prepared, and thank you very much for listening to this short presentation. I very much hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.
I was reading some things in the international media about sustainability disclosure, and I read that more than 80% of major global companies are already reporting on some aspects of their social and environmental impacts because of growing calls for transparency by civil society organizations and environmental, social, and governance ESG investors who are demanding this detailed and verified corporate sustainability information. My question for you is that is ESG data collection seen as a critical challenge for 2022, and how can companies face more ESG regulation or litigation due to these demands?
So,
yes.
So I can start if you want.
Yes, please.
So just a small correction. I'm not managing director of Pioneer. I'm managing director of Start Campus.
So sorry.
The Sinus 4.0 project. And I'm lucky enough to have been on the financial services industry for over 17 years. So I've been on the advisory side, and I've seen all the development of ESG concerns, starting initially with green, now becoming ESG. And now I'm actually a practitioner, so I'm actually developing one of the biggest projects which has some of the highest sustainability objectives in the data world. So, and I think to your question, I don't think this is a 2020 concern. I think this is a concern that has been dragging for quite a few years. I actually, when I was still an advisor, I've helped companies issuing the first, on my time, what I thought were truly green bonds in the world. And I've spoken on other panels like this. I was pretty skeptical about green bonds exactly because of that, because the ESG data that supported it was so weak and with no clear guidelines that we actually, when I dug out what existed on the green bond world, I actually found out Chinese companies developing coal power plants using green bonds. That cannot happen. And that happens because you don't have standardized information. You don't have requirements to be able to classify what's green, what's not. And then you're lacking the supervisory. I mean, if you don't have the data, you can't measure it. You can't.
It still happens today.
It's
still a reality.
It's still a reality. I think some companies are more in tune of what needs to change and what needs to happen. But what I'm finding out is some of them are still on a guess mode on what is best and how can we prove that we're more sustainable than others. There's no clear framework. I think since the first green bonds that I've issued in 2014 to today, a lot has changed, but still a lot needs to be made. And now the fact that I can use this dual hat actually gives this insight. I think on the sustainability world, we're still too focused on just the green aspect of it, and ESG is much more than green. So when you're developing a big project, and our project in particular, and if you look at the renewable projects across the globe as something to look at, it's not just by the fact that you're generating green power that should give you high marks on sustainability. You need to actually assess the entire value chain of what you're doing. You need to check where you're sourcing your materials and how can you get access to that data. Where are you sourcing those materials? Where is your equipment being manufactured? Are your suppliers, do your suppliers have good data for you to be comfortable that this is built in a sustainable way? But then also on the impact that your projects will have in the long term on the local communities. Of course, Richard was talking about real-time data. There are some parts of the value chain you don't need real-time data. Real-time data is applicable just on a small slice on what the companies or project lives actually require. But you do need to get that data right. You need to understand who are your communities, who are you're impacting. Get that data right. Work with local governments and local partners to identify those and have an holistic approach to ESG. And you're seeing a lot of mistakes still being done, where in 2021, you have a lot of projects for 2022 up to 2025. They're still missing the point. It's not just about being green. It's about ESG. It's about having the right data and see how will you affect resources, communities, and be able to showcase that in a transparent way.
That's a very good point. When I discuss with people about sustainability, unfortunately, the only thing that we have today to measure it's tons of CO2, right? That's basically the only thing that people look at, the only thing that's measurable, the only thing that has content. And then when you have a project,
that's clearly not enough, and it's too little.
But when you get, if you get a project nowadays, and because of the sustainable development goals by the United Nations, you have a list of development goals that you should have in these projects. But usually you always have the energy, the CO2 type of associated with it. So I've been exposed to some very interesting projects and some very interesting things. They're using latest technology. So if I can describe some, because that might, we might understand that we're not there, but we are on the way. So one of the interesting fintechs that we have something at Finessa, it's called Fusion Fabric.cloud. It's basically an ecosystem of fintechs. Instead of we're moving from being a software provider to an orchestrator, an ecosystem where we bring to banks whatever is best for them. It might not necessarily be our code. And in one of these fintechs, what they do is fascinating. They have contacts with the ONGs that actually classify these projects and check if they are really, really clean. I forgot the name of these ONGs. They're I think all of them in Washington. But what they do, they know how these projects get get valued, right? They know how they get, what are the sustainable development goals that you have in them. And what they do, they get at what prices these things are transacted on the private and the public market. And they use artificial intelligence to value, to get an implied value of, you know, the different SGDs that are on that particular project. So this is one of the things that we start to use technology to start to measure these development goals and start to actually, and now they're in the process of trying to find out if one of the measures is kids going to school, how do you measure that, right? If one is inclusion of women on the workforce, diversity, how do you measure that? So that's one of the things. So that goes into you being able, that being discussed here, you'll be able to have an actual measurement of these things, right? That's in the process, I think, of coming. Another point that's very important that you measure is how can you get everywhere in the world for you to check if the sustainability goals are actually being done, right? How do you get the data? So there's some fascinating things with the price of, you know, with Amazon going into, you go to the store, you pick what you want and you leave, right? And you have the price. That develops a technology of you tracking and having things that are so cheap for you to track what's happening that when you start to get on the supply chain and you have a container, you know where the things are coming from, you know where they're going to. If the price gets to the right level, then you can even use blockchain to automatically know where things are. So of course I'm talking here, when it's going to come, I don't know, but the technology is aligning to that. And when you take a look at certain things like what in particular Microsoft is doing, big data and artificial intelligence, and how you can get patterns off of the chaos is fascinating. One of the examples was done by someone at Microsoft that said if there was a project to save on biodiversity snow tigers, right? And snow tigers are difficult for you to find out where they are. So you have cameras everywhere that take pictures when something's moving, and you have people looking at the pictures, right? To find out what there is. What they did with the AI from Microsoft, they sent a bunch of pictures and said, this has snow tigers in, this do not. So the AI now combs all the pictures and comes back which ones have a snow tiger in them. But the algorithm doesn't know what a tiger is, right? So it's by pattern recognition. So when you talk about, and this is one problem because when you get a lot of data, it can be really, really, if you have a lot of data and you're smart, you can do whatever you want with the data. Look at the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, the mortgages, right? Yeah. But when you
be manipulated.
Yeah. So using AI and some of these things, you can start to extract data. One of the concerns that is raising now that's fascinating as well is the fact that the AI algorithms can have bias as well because of the people that code them, right? But what is good now is that AI is not even that developed, and people start trying to find out that there are biases in them. So I think this is a really, really good thing. So I'm very positive on how things are going. I'm very positive that the technology is going to allow us to really get us into a more sustainable path. That's very, very important. And you're talking to, I mean, I was a trader for 20 years. So green, I didn't even talk about it, right? Yeah. It's amazing.
So by now we have covered the fact that maybe not everything is that okay, but on the other hand, technology is helping with the data, and we are going in some good ways, progressing. I would like to know if we have the other speakers, Beth Burks, Janine Dow, and Todd Bridges with us. If can anyone tell us if they are joining us? Hi, Janine. Janine? Beth. Yes, we can only read lips now. We cannot hear you. We can hear a little bit, yes. Can you put your volume up or something? I don't know.
It's all the way up.
Yes, it's great. It's great now.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Hi. Perfect.
Welcome. You have been hearing what our panelists have been saying. Do you want to add something to that, and then we'll start from there?
Sure. So if you it's a little bit of a delay, but I'll try my best. So I'm Beth Burks. I'm a director on the sustainable finance team at Ratings. So we are obviously very well known in S&P for our credit ratings. And we launched 2.5 years ago an additional service called the ESG evaluation. So as an organization, S&P Ratings are both a consumer of ESG data to inform both of our opinions on the credit rating, but also on ESG scores through our ESG evaluation. But we're also a producer of data, and that is ultimately our opinions that we produce for the market that investors use when allocating their capital. So really, I think the ESG data landscape is a challenge. As Richard said, we can't really wait for sort of standardization or harmonization of data. There's still a lot we can do with it, and we have to, because we have to move fast because of the urgency. And really, I think, when it comes to ESG data, the areas where there's like a lot of very good quality data, it tends to be more on the sort of observation side in terms of the Earth observation, what's going on with the planet, and also a lot of social data coming from social economic data that you can use. And all of that tends to be fairly robust. Where we still have sort of concerns is more around the company reported data, which, as we know, is sort of not globally harmonized yet in terms of how it's calculated, but also hasn't got the assurance or the auditing. And S&P Ratings, one of our key messages is that we do really want that to change. We would like that company reported data be assured and verified by a third party who's expert in understanding the various different methodologies of calculating that data, which allows us as opinion providers to gain a lot more confidence in the benchmarking that we're asked to do as part of our assessments. However, we're still in that era where that isn't the case yet today. And so we have a challenge that we have to undertake when we're providing, for example, an ESG score on a company and opining on its performance relative to the peers and sort of the broader industry. And that challenge we attempt to solve through interacting with the companies. You actually can glean quite a lot of information about the actions that the companies are taking to address some of their key areas of risks and sort of seize on opportunities when you engage in dialogue. And that tends to be the route that most investors and our organization are taking when it comes to understanding and sort of doing a secondary glance at ESG performance, that you really need that strong interaction. And that's all what Richard said, basically. We need that trust, you need that transparency, you need that dialogue. And that's sort of the way that we're, as an organization, are trying to overcome some of the challenges that we have with ESG data. On the flip side, where we have got really good quality data within S&P Global, for example, Trucost have its physical climate change risk modeling. Use that as a way to assess what's going on in terms of the physical risk of climate change and how that might impact some of the issues within our credit ratings and sort of looking at it from a credit risk perspective. And those models help us understand not only the future trajectory of where things are going with climate change at a local level, but it also allows us to really ultimately form better questions in our interactions with issuers to help understand exactly what they're doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We know a lot of regulation is coming. I think that this whole event has mentioned quite a few examples of that. So clearly TCFD mandatory reporting is coming within the G7 bloc and beyond. This isn't just a sort of European EU non-financial reporting directive sphere. We're seeing a rising ESG-related global regulations. So, for example, even the Singapore Stock Exchange has recently announced that they are going to be making climate change reporting within financial disclosures mandatory, as well as reporting on gender diversity. So we are starting to see it come through, but that level of assurance on that company reported data is really a key piece that I think will help to strengthen that segment. So maybe I'll pause there and pass back to you, Barbara. And I'm so glad that you can hear me.
Yeah, yes. One question that I would like to ask you is that I read that the US and the European Union are pursuing different trajectories in regulating ESG investing and sustainability disclosures. How is this a problem, and how does this affect what you do and companies and this trust issue? Because what I'm hearing from you is that trust is still a big issue.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note that when we speak to companies, one of their biggest pet peeves remains the amount of resourcing and allocation that they have to commit within their organisation to deliver on the event reporting standards and requests for information from them. So generally speaking, you see that there is a vast improvement in terms of public disclosures of ESG data. But companies, no matter what they seem to report, people are always asking for more or the information presented in a different way. And that's a keen source of frustration. I think there are some positive steps that we have seen historically. So, for example, I know we mentioned earlier, it was mentioned just green bond standards and the like. So clearly there's a different taxonomy that China is taking versus EU are taking, and hopefully there is some attempts to kind of harmonise between those two regions. And the IFRS has also announced that in a couple of months' time they're going to have a sustainability standards board. But all of these initiatives are ultimately negotiations in terms of what the standards should be. And those kind of conversations have been going for many years now, and there are more and more players kind of coming forward saying that we're going to be setting the standards, we'll be setting the standards. And as Richard said, we can't really wait until then. But as all market participants, we can still continue to have dialogue and open conversations with each other about what exactly they are reporting on, why that is material to them, and to sort of kind of continue to provide strong opinions and factor in ESG within investment decision making in advance of the sort of conclusions of those discussions. I think our hope is that eventually there will be some standard and harmonisation in terms of what's sort of the most material disclosures to be had at a sector-specific way, but ultimately we're not there yet. And at S&P Ratings, we're very transparent in what we consider to be the sort of key indicators for each sectors. We've published for 21 large-scale sectors what we call our key sustainabilities. These are short documents which detail exactly what we're looking for and what we consider to be material for each sector. So I know that's just another set of potential KPIs that issuers and companies have to look at, but ultimately it's that transparency exercise that we're sort of also engaging in to help build and share ideas so that eventually as a whole market we co-align on what should be measured and disclosed and ultimately assured, audited, and integrated within the full suite of disclosures, and so that we can get ESG data up to the same standards that we observe in financial information, which took time on that side as well. We must not forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Now I would like to welcome to our discussion Todd Bridges. Hello, Todd. We can see you. From what you have been hearing, do you want to add something to the discussion before I ask you any question.
Yeah, no, again, I think Beth and covered most of the exact matters. I mean, it is a trust deficit in the market, but the infrastructure is still developing. The core kind of accounting system, the regulatory environments, the core requirements by investors, and the core understanding by corporate entities is still evolving rapidly. And until we have kind of coordinated action, maybe exactly to Beth's last point there, there will still be ambiguity, there'll still be lack of transparency, and there'll still be a lack of trust. But, again, we are making significant headways around the world by region, by all different stakeholders to try to establish the infrastructure needed for a sustainable capitalism or sustainable capital markets. And we can dive deeper into all aspects of those sustainable markets. Again, I sit within Arabesque, which is a data analytics technology company, where we're having to develop best-in-class tools, data, scoring systems, and technology platform in the absence of perfect information. Those solutions that we design and build will get better and better over time with the standardization of inputs and greater regulation and greater coordination. But overall, we need to design and build tools now, and we need to act fast.
Technology? Is it through rules? Is it through, how can it be, if not solved, make it a little bit better?
From my perspective, yeah, I mean, it's all of the above. We can't solve it as one company or set of companies, even Fitch, S&P, Arabesque, MSCI. We need to coordinate and collaborate across many different actors of the ecosystem. So we do need top-down guidance and progress and regulations. Everything still predominantly sits in the voluntary space, and companies are left to make their own decisions on the whole. But again, it's important for everyone, from the regulators to the data analytics companies, to the product designers, the asset managers and index administrators, and the companies in particular, to coordinate and collaborate and have open dialogue on getting these capital markets to be able to be calibrated, similar to what they were on traditional financial data. It took, as Beth articulated, it took years throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s to try to get the core infrastructure of traditional finance. And so similarly, now all the stakeholders need to allow for and make progress on all fronts.
If I could add, Todd, I forgot to mention, if you take a look at GDP, inflation numbers, payroll, all that requires a significant amount of data that it didn't come up in one day, right? It took a while for it to develop. And now we have stuff that is rather reliable. And you can make the case that if a GDP or a payroll number is wrong, someone might win, someone might lose, and the market might move. But people are kind of comfortable that the flows are robust and well behaved. Now the same thing needs to develop with ESG. And I'm pretty sure that if someone was there in the 50s and 60s, and you told them, or maybe the 30s, I don't remember, when GDP numbers were first published as being reliable, you would say that's crazy. How can I predict? How can I assess? Sorry, not predict. How can I assess the amount of goods and services produced in a country in a particular period? It's a massive Herculean task that now it's just normal. It's just business as usual. So yeah, Todd, I think we're going to get there.
I would add just one thing to that, which is, if you look at the example you just used, it was mostly as management tools for governments to assess the health and drive policy. And the piece of good news that I would add is that on ESG, this is market driven. The consumers of the final products are demanding this.
Yeah.
So this is being pushed through all the markets. And when Todd was saying that this is voluntary, it's not that voluntary, because these companies know that if they not meet, okay, we may not have the perfect tools to assess whether they're complying or not, but their clients are going to kill them,
Yeah.
so to speak. They're going to lose product. They're going to lose credibility, not only with the financial markets, but also with everything that goes with their operations and their sales process. And that's a change to what has been perceived in the past. And that's why I believe that this trust issue, it's because you now have so many actors with so many different agendas looking into this, that there's no single framework. There's no single framework that everyone can comply with. It's impossible. And unless everyone sits down with regulators, with agencies, with companies themselves, with the public, we're not going to get there.
And what you are saying is that companies are being
Very
forced
proactive.
to go too much fast, and they cannot keep the pace to disclose and to be accurate and to be that transparent as they should.
I think it was Richard who used the Amazon example. Take Amazon for example. They're starting to publish and they're starting to shift their ESG policies, and they're starting to issue data, not because they're being imposed by a regulator, not because the rating agencies are demanding to see it, but because their clients are demanding to do so. And once it became important to their clients, all of a sudden the capital markets said, okay, this is something, this is important. The companies can actually perform better or worse if they do not tackle that, because their profits are going to go down. So we need to start focusing on this as well. So this is driving the entire market to shift. And now, of course, the question becomes, how can we provide transparent data that everyone can assess and be comfortable that what's being shown?
I think there is another driver for this as well. As the driver is the vaulting, right? Because what ends up happening is, the Amazon distribution centers are meant to look like, semi-slavery camps or something like that. Then you're going to start to have press and political pressure on the politicians to come and chase them. So I think some of these big companies are looking really hard on what they've been doing, right? Even Apple now has some sort of thing going on in terms of culture and all that, because the press is going to put pressure on them, and then the regulatory bodies are going to come. So I think there are the two things. I think you have the consumer pressure, but I think the consumer pressure, one of the ways that is really showing on this bigger monsters, because if you want to buy something today and want to buy it online, you either buy on eBay or Amazon, right? You have very little, you don't have many alternatives, right? You can, if you're in the UK, you can buy using Argos and all that, but at the end of the day, if you want to, you go to Amazon. So a good chunk of the market doesn't have an alternative, but at the minute that you start to see that they have tax evasion and all sorts of stuff, then the government goes after them, and the government will go after them. So I think they're being preemptive. What's not a bad thing.
Yes, it's good.
Thank you. Do we have Janine Dow with us yet?
Unfortunately, she's trying to get through and she just can't. This is the message that we've got. So I think we can't, because we have to wrap up by 1 o'clock for lunch.
Okay.
I think, unfortunately, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get her through between now and 1 o'clock. So.
Okay. Giving this that we have been discussing. Do you want to add anything else on this topic of being important and what companies, from the company's point of view, because clients are demanding, the investors are demanding, banks, companies are not in a very good situation because of this pandemic and the economic crisis. Is this too difficult to manage for companies? Beth, I don't know if you can.
Sure, I don't think it's too difficult to manage. I think that they're very used to handling their own proprietary data internally. And generally, the sustainability teams have a good handle on it and are increasingly being absorbed into the overall governance of the organization, so into Tim's financial controllers and so on. And that will help with you know, as the controls are kind of put in place internally to make sure that the data is up to scratch. Because, you know, one of the things I think that companies still fear is this risk of having to restate data. So when we have a restatement of financial information, clearly that indicates to us that there's a failure overall of the governance of that information within an organization. And I think there is a fear that with companies that if they do have to restate ESG data because it's maybe not gone through the same controls and checks, that will start to become increasingly a signal of overall poor governance of the organization. So I think that that's one area where they're really trying to strengthen their reporting, their internal reporting, to make sure it is up to the same sort of standards that they're used to for the financial side. And I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about yet is the cadence of ESG data. So there's still some debate about how frequently they should be reporting these metrics. I know there's still that debate on the financial side. It should be quarterly, half year, or annual. Tends to be the discussion. And I think, you know, the other side that we have on the financial side that we haven't even yet started on, or you see it rarely, but not very often, is whether or not there should be ESG data, especially environmental and social, should be segmented according to different business activities, which can be increasingly important when you start to see organizations consolidate across the value chain. So, for example, I cover one company in the coal energy sector who historically were a coal miner and bought coal power generation assets. And clearly, those two have incredibly different environmental profiles and emissions. So the need for sort of segmented ESG data is also kind of being pushed forward in order to get the sort of correct benchmarking. You're looking at how a company is performing versus sector peers or peers that have supposedly similar technologies and controls in place. So I think that's another area just to mention briefly.
Thank you. Todd, I would like to ask you, what disclosure is most, what do you think, what disclosure is most useful to analysts and other stakeholders? Can you provide some examples?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, again, I think what we've been talking about for the last few minutes is this: what is and who determines material metrics or materiality? What actually affects the risk return profile of the company, or whether there needs to be a broader definition of what is material information. Again, there are different views on this, right? The Europeans and the GRI and series of bodies around the world have a very broad scope, double materiality or dual materiality. Then you have kind of the US SASB perspective, which is very focused on a key set of indicators that are directly, quantitatively linked to the enterprise value creation of a firm. And so, you know, I think there is different regulators and institutions taking a stance on this. What is material? And, you know, that corresponds to a set of different forms of indicators. You know, this is the debate that's going on within the IFRS to try to determine what set of core material indicators are required. Is it material indicators within climate, Is it material indicators within the broader ES&G? Is it closely tracking such things such as the GRI or SASB? The SEC is going to take probably a much more scoped vision of what is determined to be material, minimizing the cost and structure of what is needing to be captured internal to the corporation and what will be required to be pushed out to markets. Maybe Beth, to your exact point, I was coming to it. It is really, I think it's important for most investors and corporates are generally agreed that the climate indicators, right, to get the GHG scope emissions of your organization governed, being able to track that internally and to understand where you are on the carbon pathways. So that is where the likes of some of the technology companies, right, Alphabet, Amazon, there are a number of companies making claims about the 20 and 30 and 2050 net zero and what they're doing. And those, according to investors and potentially regulators, are the material indicators that will be needed.
Thank you. Do we still have Richard with us? No, Richard? No longer. I would like to hear what since you all commented. So I thank you so much for your presence. I don't know if any of you wants to add anything else from this discussion, anything that we didn't cover that I didn't ask.
No, I just would like to thank the opportunity to be here and talk to you and everyone else. Thank you very much.
Barbara, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our guests and our panel for helping us today with what was a really interesting panel. And I'm sure there's a lot of takeaways there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. You really made my job very easy. And I take so many lessons from this panel today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.